good evening, and welcome. For now, find a comfortable position and allow the day to fall away. If you enjoy these calm accounts of strange encounters, you can like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the stories still ahead. Our first account begins in a suburban backyard beside a cold metal chair and a single white point that stayed still while the night moved around it. Chapter 1. The Light That Outlasted the Stars. At approximately 11:15 p.m., Nolan Pierce stepped into the backyard of the small rental house where he had been living for several months. The house stood near the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Beyond the final row of back fences, the ground opened into darker fields and scattered trees. It was not remote, but at that hour it could feel separated from the rest of town. Nolan carried his phone and nothing else. He was not planning to photograph the sky. He had no telescope, binoculars, or star chart. He only wanted a little cold air before going to bed. A metal lawn chair stood near the back door. He sat down, rested the phone beside him, and looked across the adjoining yards. That was when he noticed the light. It appeared above the neighbor's shed, close to the roofline from Nolan's position. A small white point, sharp and steady. There was nothing dramatic about it. At first, Nolan took it for a star. The sky was clear enough for several brighter stars to remain visible above the houses, and the light seemed to belong among them. It did not pulse. It did not change color. It did not sweep across the yard or cast a glow onto the roof below. It simply remained there. Nolan looked away for a while. He checked his phone, listened to a vehicle passing several streets over, and watched a downstairs light switch off in a nearby house. When his attention returned to the sky, the white point was still above the shed. He began using the objects around it as references. The lower edge of the light seemed to sit just above the corner of the roof. A fence post stood beneath it, and slightly to the right. From the chair, those 2 points made its position easy to remember. At 11:47 p.m., Nolan checked again. The light had not shifted. He knew that judging movement in the night sky could be difficult. Clouds might create the illusion of motion. A person's head could move without them noticing. Even a bright star could appear to wander when viewed against an empty patch of darkness. So Nolan adjusted his position. He leaned to one side, then sat upright again. The light changed position relative to the roof when he moved, exactly as a distant object should. But when he settled back into the same place, it returned to the same narrow space above the shed. The neighborhood continued around him. A dog barked once, and then stopped. A heating system came on inside one of the houses, somewhere behind the fence. Dry leaves scraped lightly across paving stones. Nothing about the night suggested that an unusual event was taking place. That normality kept Nolan in the chair. Had the yard gone silent, or had the light begun moving quickly, he might have gone inside. Instead, the object offered no clear reason for fear. It looked almost too ordinary to deserve attention. By 12:26 a.m., he had begun comparing it with the stars around it. Several points farther west had changed their relation to the roofs. Some had moved closer to branches. Others had become partly hidden behind chimneys, or disappeared beyond the line of the houses. The white light remained where Nolan had first marked it. It also lacked the slight flicker visible in the lower stars near the horizon. Layers of air usually cause starlight to tremble or change brightness. This point stayed clean, no red edge, no blue flash, no soft pulse, just white. A planet was another possibility. Planets often shine more steadily than stars, and one low in the sky could appear unusually bright. Nolan considered that explanation without knowing enough astronomy to confirm it, but a planet should still move with the larger sky. This one did not seem to. He went indoors shortly after 12:30. The cold had reached through his clothes, and remaining outside was beginning to feel foolish. Nolan left the chair where it was and stood in the kitchen for several minutes, drinking water and trying not to look through the window. He expected the interest to fade once he was inside. Instead, the light became harder to ignore. The yacht's problem was not what it had done. It had done nothing. The problem was the possibility that it was still there, holding the same place above the roof, while Nolan stood only a few steps away. He returned to the backyard. The white point waited in the same position. Nolan sat again and began checking the time less often. Minutes passed without any visible change. His eyes grew tired from moving between the light, the roof corner, and the surrounding stars. At 1:18 a.m., the wider pattern became clearer. The sky had continued its slow westward turn. Stars that had been well above the houses were now closer to them. A bright point Nolan had used as a secondary reference had shifted noticeably toward a tall tree. The object above the shed remained fixed. There was no visible support beneath it. No tower, wire, mast, or hill rose behind the house. Nolan had seen the neighborhood in daylight many times. He knew the roofline and the open sky beyond it. If the light belonged to something on the ground, he could not identify what held it there. If it belonged to the sky, it was not moving with the rest of the sky. The longer Nolan watched, the less useful the usual labels became. Star, planet, aircraft, tower light. Each explained the appearance. None explained the stillness. Some time after that, Nolan fell asleep in the chair. It was not deep sleep. The cold kept pulling him back toward awareness, and his neck had begun to ache from the angle of his head. When he opened his eyes again, the darkness had softened. He checked the phone. It was 4:41 a.m. The yard had changed completely. The black spaces between the houses were turning gray. Roof tiles, fence boards, and tree branches were becoming visible again. Many of the weaker stars had already disappeared into the first light of morning. The white point was still above the neighbor's shed. The night had moved. The light had not. Nolan stood, partly to warm himself, and partly to confirm that he was fully awake. He returned to the same position behind the chair and aligned the roof corner with the fence post. There it was, fainter now, but not displaced. As dawn continued, the light began to thin. It did not drop behind the roof. It did not rise, travel sideways, flash, or divide into smaller points. Its edges simply became less certain against the brightening sky. Nolan watched the place closely. For a moment, he could still separate the white point from the pale blue around it. Then he could not. The light faded in the same position it had occupied throughout the night, leaving no movement for Nolan to follow. Birds began calling from the trees beyond the neighborhood. A door closed inside a nearby house. Water moved through pipes. And an early car started somewhere along the street. Morning returned in pieces. Nolan remained in the yard for several more minutes, staring above the shed and trying to recover the exact point where the light had been. In daylight, there was nothing to mark it, only open sky above an ordinary roof. He never claimed that the object was a craft. He could not rule out a celestial body, an unusual reflection, or some fixed light source he had failed to identify. There was no photograph that showed what several hours had revealed. A single image would have contained only one small white point above a dark roof. The disturbance came from comparison. Stars shifted. Dawn approached. The neighborhood moved from sleep toward morning. Nolan himself grew cold, tired, and stiff in the chair. Through all of it, the light stayed above one house, and long after that night, whenever Nolan looked across a roofline after dark, he found himself waiting to see whether every point in the sky was moving as it should. Chapter 2. The ridge after the birds stopped. By early afternoon, Nate Holloway had already been on the trail for several hours. The route climbed through a familiar stretch of forest toward a rocky ridge. Nate had walked it often enough to know where the ground became uneven, where roots crossed the path, and where the trees opened briefly toward the higher slope. The weather was cool and dry. Sunlight passed cleanly through the branches. There was almost no wind. Nothing about the day felt threatening. Birds moved through the trees above him. Insects hummed near the low brush. Small sounds came from fallen leaves and hidden ground animals. The forest was not loud, but it was full of life. Then every sound stopped. It did not fade gradually. One moment, the woods held birds, insects, and movement. The next, Nate could hear only the faint scrape of his own boot against the trail. He stopped in the middle of a step. The sudden quiet felt too complete to be caused by a passing cloud or a change in wind. Even the smaller sounds had vanished. No wing beats, no buzzing close to the ground, no movement inside the brush. Nate waited. He expected a bird to call from farther down the slope, or an insect to begin again near his ear. Nothing did. The silence seemed to have arrived before he understood there was anything to notice. He looked first along the trail, then into the trees. Only after turning toward the ridge did he see the object above it. A smooth oval hung in the bright sky. Its surface appeared metallic, though not polished like chrome. It carried a dull reflection of daylight, more like brushed metal seen from a distance. There were no wings, rotors, windows, or visible seams. No lights, no exhaust. The object made no sound at all. Nate placed it roughly 50 to 60 feet above the rocky ridge, though he knew the mountain made distance difficult to judge. The object could have been farther away and larger than it appeared. It might also have been closer and smaller. He could not determine its true size. What he could see was its shape, a broad oval with a smooth outline, hanging level above the ridge without swaying or turning. A balloon seemed unlikely. The air was nearly still near the ground, but even a balloon would have shown some drift. A drone might hover, though Nate could not imagine one that size remaining completely silent at that distance. A reflective aircraft should have continued across the sky. This did none of those things. Nate slowly lowered his backpack onto the trail. The movement felt unusually loud. A buckle touched stone with a small metallic click, and the sound seemed to travel farther than it should have through the empty forest. He took several steps away from the path, moving between thin trees for a clearer view. The oval remained over the ridge. From this angle, part of its lower surface appeared darker. There was no clear shadow on the rocks below, and no change in the light around it. It seemed present, without interacting with the landscape beneath it. Nate became aware of the strange position in which he was standing. A few steps back, the trees had blocked this section of sky. A few steps farther down the trail, the ridge would have hidden it. He had reached one narrow opening where the object could be seen clearly. The thought made him uneasy. It felt less like finding something in the sky, and more like entering the only place from which it was visible. He glanced behind him. The trail remained empty. The trees stood still. Sunlight lay across the dry ground in pale patches, and when Nate looked back toward the ridge, the object was no longer in the same position. It now hung farther to the left. He had not seen it move. There had been no blur, acceleration, or path across the sky. One moment, it was above the center of the ridge. The next, it occupied a separate position near the outer slope. No motion between them. Nate stared at the space the object had apparently crossed. He tried to decide whether he had turned his head long enough to miss an ordinary movement. The change had happened during only a brief glance behind him. An aircraft could cross part of the sky in that time. A drone could shift sideways, but the object's new position looked too exact, as though it had been removed from one place and set down in another. It remained level, still silent. Nate reached toward the pocket holding his phone. His hand stopped before he pulled it out, and the quiet around him had changed. It was no longer only an absence of animal sound. The silence seemed closer now, almost physical, as if the open space between the trees and ridge had become sealed. He could hear his breathing. He could hear fabric move against his shoulder, nothing else. Nate later struggled to explain why he did not immediately begin recording. The phone was within reach. The object remained visible. There was enough daylight for a clear image, yet taking his attention away from it, even for a few seconds, felt unsafe. The metallic surface began to darken. At first, Nate thought a thin cloud had passed in front of the sun, but the ground around him remained bright. The oval simply lost contrast against the sky. Its edges softened, blending with the pale blue behind it. The shape did not rise. It did not retreat into the distance. It became harder to separate from the air around it. Nate took one step forward. The object was still there, but only barely. A flat gray outline where the oval had been. Then the outline was gone. The ridge stood empty beneath the open sky. For several seconds, Nate remained completely still. His hand was still near his pocket. His backpack lay behind him on the trail. The first sound to return was a bird call from somewhere beyond the slope. Another answered from deeper in the forest. Insects resumed near the brush. Leaves shifted as something small moved across the ground. The woods filled again so quickly that Nate noticed each layer returning. The silence had ended almost as suddenly as it began. He retrieved his backpack and continued only far enough to reach a broader clearing. From there, he watched the ridge for several minutes. Nothing appeared above it. The rest of the hike felt ordinary, but Nate no longer experienced the normal forest sounds as background. Every bird and insect seemed to confirm that the environment was working again. He returned to the same trail later. In daylight, the ridge offered no hidden structure, tower, reflective surface, or equipment that could explain the oval. The viewing angle was exactly as he remembered it. Trees blocked the sky from most parts of the path, leaving only that short opening where the object had appeared. Nate accepted that he might have misjudged its distance. He could not prove the silence was connected to the object. A drone, balloon, or aircraft remained possible in theory, but none of those explanations accounted easily for the shift he had not seen happen. And whenever the forest becomes quiet now, Nate does not wait for the birds to return. He looks toward the ridge first. Chapter 3. The shape the camera saw. Liam Morgan chose the reservoir because it offered almost nothing to interrupt the sky. The gravel turnout sat about 15 minutes outside town, far enough from the brighter streets to keep the horizon dark. Open water stretched beyond the roadside barrier, and the moon stood clear above it. Liam had been taking night photographs for years. He knew the small problems that could ruin an image. A passing insect could become a blurred disc. A bird could turn into a stretched shadow. A plane might appear as a broken line of light. A slight vibration in the tripod could soften the moon's edge without being obvious at the time. He arrived at approximately 10:40 p.m. and began working through those problems one at a time. The tripod legs went down on firm gravel. He checked the camera mount twice, adjusted the focus, reviewed a test image, and changed the exposure. The first photograph showed exactly what he expected. A bright moon, a dark sky, a few faint stars, nothing more. The air near the reservoir was cold enough to make Liam keep his hands in his jacket between adjustments. The water below the turnout was mostly hidden in darkness, though he could hear small waves reaching the shore. Every few minutes, he looked directly at the moon rather than through the camera. That habit mattered to him. Night photography could become too dependent on the screen. Liam preferred to compare what the sensor captured with what his own eyes had seen. He watched for thin cloud, aircraft, birds, bats, and anything else that might cross the frame. Several planes passed far from the moon. Their lights were easy to track. A few insects moved close to the camera. One left a soft streak across an early exposure. Nothing crossed the lunar disk. Liam continued making small changes. He shortened one exposure, lengthened another, and adjusted the framing so the moon sat slightly higher and in the image. The work was routine. At approximately 11:20 p.m., he packed the equipment and drove home. The unusual part of the night began only after he was indoors. Liam transferred the photographs to his computer and started reviewing them in order. Most were close variations of the same view. Some were sharper. It's just others held a little more detail along the moon's darker edge. Then he reached the image time-stamped at 11:07:14 p.m. A dark, triangular shape crossed the lower right portion of the moon. Liam stopped scrolling. The silhouette was not bright enough to contain surface detail. It appeared almost completely black against the lunar disk, with three broad edges forming a shape that looked more solid than a passing blur. He enlarged the image. The form occupied only part of the moon, entering from the lower right side and cutting across the bright surface. Its outline was not perfectly sharp, but it was far more defined than the insects Liam had photographed at close range. The first thought was a bird. That explanation would have been simple. A bird flying between the camera and moon could create a dark shape, especially if the exposure was short enough to reduce motion blur. But the silhouette did not resemble the birds Liam had captured before. There were no visible wing shapes, no curved body, no uneven edge that suggested feathers or movement. The form looked broad, flat, and triangular. A bat seemed possible for the same reason, and failed for much the same reason. Liam opened the photographs taken immediately around it. The earlier frame, recorded at approximately 11:07:09 p.m., showed a clean moon. The later frame, recorded at approximately 11:07:19 p.m., also showed a clean moon, 5 seconds on either side. No approaching object, no shape leaving the frame, only the single photograph between them. Liam checked the sequence again to make sure no files were missing. The numbering was continuous. The timestamps followed normally. The camera had not produced an obvious error warning or shut down. He returned to the strange image. A plane crossing the moon could appear suddenly and leave quickly, depending on its speed and distance. Yet an aircraft large enough to form such a broad shape should likely have shown some recognizable structure. Wings, a tail, a slight blur along the direction of travel. The image showed none of those clearly. A drone was another possibility. Liam had photographed drones before. They often produced compact shapes, visible arms, or lights. Even when those details disappeared against a bright background, their outline rarely formed such a clean triangle. Still, distance and angle could distort almost anything. Liam kept that possibility open. He searched through older folders for comparisons. Birds against clouds, insects near a streetlight, a plane crossing a pale evening sky, sensor dust, compression blocks, images affected by slight camera shake. Each comparison offered one similar feature. None matched the whole shape. The longer Liam studied it, the less certain he became. That uncertainty did not make the image less troubling. It made it more so. A clear photograph of an obvious aircraft would have ended the matter. A blurred insect would have been easy to dismiss. Instead, the frame held enough structure to resist a simple answer, but not enough detail to support a confident one. There was also something unusual along one edge. The moonlight nearest the upper side of the silhouette appeared slightly bent or softened, not simply covered, warped. The effect was subtle. Liam could not tell whether the light itself looked distorted, or whether digital sharpening had created a false border. Bright objects against dark shapes often produced halos and edge artifacts, especially after image processing. He opened the original file again and disabled every automatic correction he could. The apparent distortion remained, though less clearly. That did not prove anything. Liam knew how easily an image could encourage the eye to invent a structure. Once a person expected a strange effect, ordinary pixels could begin looking meaningful. He refused to treat the warped edge as evidence by itself. Instead, he returned to the most basic problem. He had been watching the moon, not constantly, but repeatedly. The camera was not left unattended for a long period. Liam had checked the sky throughout the session, especially near the times when he changed settings. He remembered no dark object crossing the lunar surface. Something large enough to create the silhouette should have been easy to notice if he happened to be looking at the right instant, but the crossing may have lasted less than a second. His eyes could have been on the camera controls. He might simply have missed it. That was possible. The photograph did not reveal how far away the object was. A tiny insect close to the lens could cover the same part of the moon as a much larger object, high in the sky, without a second angle, another witness, or a known distance. Size could not be calculated. The triangle might have been small. It might have been enormous. The frame could not tell him which. Liam later showed the image to several people without first explaining what he believed it showed. Their answers varied. A bird, a plane, a drone, a damaged image, something unusual. The reactions followed the same pattern as Liam's own thinking. Everyone recognized the shape. No one could identify it with confidence. He kept the original file and the images before and after it. He did not claim that the photograph showed a craft, and he did not present the apparent warping as proof of anything beyond a difficult edge in a difficult image. Yet the frame continued to bother him for a reason, separate from its shape. During the entire session, the reservoir had felt empty. Liam had watched the moon directly. He had listened for aircraft. He had noticed insects and distant planes. Nothing in the sky had drawn his attention. The camera recorded something his memory did not. One image contained a crossing. The witness did not. Chapter 4. The orb above the sleeping houses. Archer noticed it before Ryan Holloway did. The shepherd mix had been walking loosely at Ryan's side. stopping now and then to smell damp grass or the base of a mailbox. He weighed close to 70 pounds and was not easily startled. Sudden noises usually earned a glance. Strange dogs made him curious, rather than afraid. Near midnight, on a cold, late fall night, Archer became rigid. His front paw remained lifted above the pavement. The fur along the back of his neck rose in a narrow line. Instead of looking toward a yard or an approaching animal, he stared above the houses across the street. At that same moment, the porch lights along the block dipped. Not one house, all of them. The light faded for less than a second and returned at once. Ryan first assumed there had been a brief change in the power supply. The streetlights remained on, and no alarm sounded. Nothing inside the dark home seemed disturbed. Then, Archer pressed against Ryan's leg. Ryan followed the dog's gaze. A pale orb was moving beyond the rooftops. It was not high in the sky. From Ryan's position, it seemed to pass just above the houses and the power lines that ran behind them. The light was dimmer than the moon and softer than a street lamp, yet its outline remained easy to follow against the darkness. There were no flashing red or green lights, no visible wings, no engine sound. The orb drifted along the length of the block at a steady pace. It did not sway in the cold air, or rise and fall like a lantern. Its path looked controlled, almost level with the upper branches of the taller trees. Ryan watched the roofs beneath it. They remained dark. A searchlight or bright drone should have placed some glow on the shingles, chimneys, or bare branches. This light seemed strangely contained. It could be seen, but it did not properly light the things around it. Archer gave a low sound from deep in his chest. Ryan had heard him growl at other dogs and at people approaching the yard. This was different. The sound was quieter and less certain, as though the dog had not decided whether the thing above them was close enough to challenge or too unfamiliar to understand. Ryan took out his phone. The screen opened normally. He selected the camera and pointed it above the houses. On the display, the orb became a tiny, pale mark. The image did not preserve what Ryan was seeing directly. The distance flattened. The dark roofs disappeared into one black band, and the object looked like an ordinary point of light, without depth or scale. He tried to zoom in. The camera froze. For a moment, the live image stopped moving, even though Ryan's hand continued to shake slightly. Then the display turned black. The controls remained visible around the edges, but the camera view itself showed nothing. Ryan lowered the phone. The orb was still there. The porch lights flickered a second time. Again, the change affected several houses at once. Light vanished from porches, windows, and decorative lamps, then returned in the same instant. The streetlights above Ryan gave no visible reaction. Archer stepped backward and pulled against the leash. Ryan moved with him, but kept watching the sky. A drone remained the most direct explanation. Small aircraft could travel low over neighborhoods, and distance could hide their structure. Electric motors were sometimes difficult to hear over wind, traffic, and other city noise. But there was almost no wind. The street was quiet enough for Ryan to hear Archer breathing beside him. A drone low over the roofs should have produced some hum, especially as it passed near the power lines. The orb remained silent. It reached the far end of the block and stopped above a dark tree line. The halt was smooth. There was no visible slowing, no small correction, and no drifting after it became still. One moment, it was moving. The next, it held its place. Ryan looked around for another witness. Most windows were dark. A television gave off a weak blue glow behind one set of curtains, but no one appeared at a door or window. The block seemed to sleep beneath the object. Archer's body had become even tighter. The dog's head was low, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tree line. His ears pointed forward. When Ryan placed a hand on his back, he could feel the muscles held hard beneath the fur. The area around the orb seemed wider than the visible light. Stars near it looked faded. A few points that should have been clear through the bare branches appeared blurred or smeared across a patch of sky larger than the orb itself. Ryan shifted several steps along the sidewalk to make sure thin cloud or moisture on his eyes was not causing the effect. The pale distortion remained around the same place. His phone camera returned without warning. Ryan raised it again. The orb appeared on the screen, but only as a weak white spot. When he tried recording, the image briefly stalled a second time before continuing. The file later showed a small light above a dark line of houses, followed by a short, frozen section that offered no useful detail. To anyone who had not stood beneath it, the recording looked ordinary. Archer pulled again. This time, he did not step backward. He turned fully toward home and leaned into the leash with enough force to move Ryan's arm. Ryan resisted for a moment. The orb resumed its movement. It did not accelerate. It began drifting sideways from the tree line at the same restrained speed it had shown above the houses. As it moved, its brightness weakened. The outline softened until the object seemed less like a sphere and more like a pale stain in the sky. The porch lights flickered for the third time. Archer pulled hard. Ryan followed. They moved quickly along the sidewalk, Ryan looking back over his shoulder, while the dog kept his attention on the direction of home. The light passed behind the upper branches, though the branches never appeared illuminated from behind. Then it dimmed completely. There was no flash and no sudden departure. The pale shape simply lost brightness until Ryan could no longer separate it from the darkness above the trees. Ordinary sound returned to the block in small layers. A distant car crossed an intersection. Heating equipment started behind one of the houses. A loose gate tapped against a post. Archer's collar made a familiar metallic sound as his pace slowed. By the time they reached home, the dog was breathing normally again. Ryan checked the lights inside his house and found nothing reset. The microwave clock remained correct. No breaker had tripped. His phone battery had not dropped sharply, and the camera began working as though nothing had happened. The next day, Ryan casually asked several neighbors whether their electricity had flickered during the night. None remembered a power problem. One had been awake reading. Another had fallen asleep with the television on. Neither had noticed lights across the block, dimming 3 separate times. That left Ryan with a poor recording, a silent object, and a dog that could not explain what it had sensed. A drone could account for low moving light. A brief electrical fluctuation could explain a flicker. A camera could freeze because of an ordinary software fault. The difficulty was not any one detail, it was the way they arrived together. Archer remained tense during late walks for several weeks. Near the place where he had first stopped, he would raise his head and study the roofs before continuing. Ryan began doing the same. Chapter 5. The Glow Centered. Over the house, at 2:34 a.m., Matt Corbin woke because the room was bright, not morning bright, not the sharp yellow of a lamp left on. This was a pale, even light that had reached through the closed blinds and spread across the bedroom without seeming to come from any one direction. The ceiling was visible. So were the closet door, the the edge of a chair, and the clothes folded across it. Matt remained still for several seconds. His first thought was that a vehicle had turned into the driveway. The house stood outside town, in an area where farms had slowly given way to small subdivisions. Cars sometimes missed a turn and used a driveway to reverse, but headlights moved. They swept across walls, shifted with the vehicle, and disappeared. This light did not. Matt checked the time on his phone, then crossed the room and lifted one corner of the blind. The backyard looked pale and drained of color. Above the house, low in the sky, a broad oval glow filled part of the cloud cover. It was not a bright point shining through the clouds. The clouds themselves appeared lit from within, though only across one defined area. The center of the glow sat almost directly above the roof. Beyond its edge, the neighboring yards were much darker. One house across the field was barely visible. Another roof farther down the road remained almost black. The illumination did not spread evenly across the neighborhood. It seemed centered on Matt's home. He opened the window. Cold air entered the room, carrying the damp smell of the yard. Matt listened for the sound that should have accompanied so much light. There was no helicopter, no engine, no tires on the nearby road. He could not hear insects, dogs, distant farm equipment, or the steady traffic that usually reached the house as a soft background murmur. Even the branch that often tapped the outer wall had become still. Matt leaned closer to the open window. The glow above him remained smooth. There were no sweeping beams and no bright source moving behind the cloud. The oval held the same shape, with a soft but visible boundary separating it from the darker sky. A searchlight was possible. Someone might have been using powerful equipment from a field or road beyond the house, yet a searchlight should have produced an angle, a shaft through the air, or stronger light on one side of the property. Matt could see none of those things. He pulled on a jacket and went downstairs. The house felt different before he reached the back door, not colder or warmer. The air seemed heavier, as though a storm were pressing against the walls despite the absence of wind. When he opened the door, the quiet became unmistakable. The yard was wet from earlier rain. Grass pressed dark against his shoes, and the paving stones held a thin shine. Under normal light, each stone should have cast some form of shadow. There were almost none. The pale glow revealed the yard without pointing across it. The fence, garden tools, and small storage box were visible, yet their shadows were weak and difficult to place. Matt moved his arm and watched the ground. No clear shape followed it. The light seemed to come from above, around, and nowhere he could identify. He stepped farther from the door. That was when he noticed the vibration. It was too low to hear as a normal sound. Matt felt it first in his chest, then along his jaw and teeth. A faint pressure repeating without rhythm, more like standing near distant machinery than listening to an engine. He placed a hand against the siding. The wall did not visibly shake. The pressure remained inside his body. Matt looked straight up. The clouds appeared much lower than they should have been. Their illuminated center was almost featureless, but darker shapes seemed to form behind it for a second at a time. They were not stable enough to describe as objects. Each time he tried to focus on one, it blended into the surrounding gray. There might have been several darker sections. There might have been only uneven cloud. The pale oval stayed centered over the roof. Matt moved toward the far end of the yard to test whether the glow would shift relative to the house. From near the fence, the brightest area still appeared directly above the roof peak. The boundary ended before reaching the neighboring property. It was as though someone had drawn a wide circle over the building and left everything outside it untouched. Matt turned back toward the bedroom window. The lamp beside his bed switched on. He saw the warm yellow light appear through the blinds. It was clearly different from the pale illumination outside, and Matt knew he had not touched the switch before leaving the room. For the first time, the event felt directed toward the house rather than merely positioned above it. The pressure in his chest deepened. Matt took several steps toward the door. As he moved, the oval above the roof seemed to narrow. Its outer edge drew inward, and the brighter center tightened toward the highest point of the house. The change was slow enough to follow. The light was becoming more concentrated. Matt did not wait to see what followed. He went inside, locked the door, and stood in the kitchen with his back against it. Through the window, the yard remained pale. The low vibration passed through the room in faint waves, though none of the glasses or objects on the counters visibly moved. Upstairs, the bedroom lamp was still on. Matt checked the switches downstairs. Nothing else had changed. The refrigerator continued running, and the digital clock on the stove remained active. There had been no general power failure. He climbed the stairs without turning on the hall light. In the bedroom, the lamp switch was in the on position. Matt could not remember leaving it that way before bed. He usually turned the lamp off by hand, and the light had been dark when he first woke. He moved the switch down, then stood beside the window. The pale oval had become smaller. He checked his phone again. It was 2:48 a.m. The glow began to fade inward. Its edges darkened first, drawing toward the center in a controlled contraction. The final bright area remained above the roof peak for only a moment longer. Then, over approximately 5 or 6 seconds, it dimmed completely. The pressure ended with it, not gradually. One moment, Matt could feel the vibration in his chest and teeth. The next, it was absent. Sound returned almost immediately. A vehicle passed on the distant road. A dog barked from somewhere beyond the field. The loose branch beside the house resumed tapping against the wall. Matt stood at the window and listened to each ordinary noise. The bedroom no longer looked pale. Only the faint gray of night remained behind the blinds. He did not sleep again. After sunrise, Matt inspected the roof, gutters, yard, and outside walls. He found no marks, heat damage, flattened grass, residue, or broken equipment. The bedroom lamp worked normally. No other clocks had reset. The property looked untouched. Later, he checked the weather record for the night. The forecast history listed cloud cover as high and thin. It did not describe a low layer hanging close above the houses. There had been no storm warning and no report of unusual fog. That discrepancy did not prove the glowing layer was something other than cloud. Weather apps could be wrong, and conditions, say, outside town could differ from the nearest reporting station. A helicopter might have passed too quietly for Matt to identify. A distant searchlight could have reflected from a lower patch of moisture. The lamp might have been left partly switched on or affected by a small electrical fault. Each detail had a possible answer. Together they formed something harder to settle. The light had stopped at the boundaries of his yard. The neighboring roofs remained dark. The air had carried pressure without sound. Shadows had nearly vanished, and a lamp inside the room had turned on while Matt stood beneath the glow outside. For several nights afterward, he woke and checked the time before opening his eyes fully. The room was always dark. The roof above him was always silent, but 2:34 a.m. no longer felt like an ordinary hour. and the next account would carry that same silence away from a house and place it above rough, open water. Chapter 6. The Light That Entered the Lake. The lake was already rough when Grant Holloway reached the shore. He arrived shortly after 5 a.m., carrying a small tackle bag, a folding seat, and the quiet expectation of spending the first part of the morning alone. The place was familiar to him. He knew which rocks became slick after rain, where the water deepened close to shore, and how the wind usually moved across the open surface before dawn. That morning, the wind was strong enough to push cold air through his jacket. White caps formed farther out and broke apart in the darkness. Waves struck the shoreline rocks with uneven force, sometimes spraying the lower stones. Trees behind Grant moved constantly, their branches bending and releasing in long, restless motions. The lake was full of movement. Against that movement, one light remained completely still. Grant first noticed it while setting down his gear. A clean white shape stood above the water, roughly 100 yards offshore. From a distance, it looked like a bright marker or a lamp fixed to a small boat. He continued preparing his fishing line. There were many ordinary reasons for a light to be on the lake before sunrise. A boat could be anchored farther out. A buoy might carry a lamp. Someone might be checking nets, equipment, or shoreline property. Grant expected some sign of that explanation to appear. A second light, a hull, a person moving. The sound of an engine. Nothing did. At 5:17 a.m., he checked the time and stopped working on the line. The light had not shifted. It was white, without any visible color around the edges. It did not blink or rotate. Its shape was nearly round, though slightly stretched from top to bottom, like a narrow oval standing upright above the surface. The wind crossed the lake from Grant's left. Anything floating should have responded. Even an anchored boat would have risen and fallen with the waves. A buoy should have tilted, dipped, or moved in a small, repeating pattern. The light showed no such motion. It stayed at the same height, the same angle, the same apparent distance. Grant watched the water beneath it. That was where the scene became difficult to explain. Ordinary lights reflected across the rough surface in broken pieces. The few lamps visible far along the opposite shore produced long, unstable lines that opened and closed with every wave. The white object's reflection was different. A narrow strip of brightness extended beneath it, but the reflection did not scatter widely across the moving water. It remained contained in a small vertical area, almost as steady as the object itself. Waves passed through the same part of the lake. The bright strip barely changed. Grant left the folding seat and stepped onto the darker rocks near the water. They were wet, and he moved carefully, using one hand against a larger stone for balance. From the lower position, the object appeared a little more elongated. It was not a perfect point. There was enough shape to suggest that the light had a top and a lower edge. It still gave no clear illumination to the lake around it. The water beneath the object did not appear brighter, except for the narrow reflection. No beam reached downward. No broad glow spread across the waves. Grant took out his phone. The screen showed the light as a soft white mark in a field of darkness. It appeared smaller than it did to his eyes, and the rough water was almost invisible around it. He began recording anyway. The phone captured the sound of wind and waves clearly. It also recorded the light, though without the sense of distance or stillness that made it strange. On the screen, it could have been a distant lamp or a bright star, low above the horizon. Directly in front of Grant, it did not look like either. The object was too low to be a star, and the opposite shoreline lay much farther beyond it. A boat remained possible, but Grant could not see any part of one. He lowered the phone and continued watching. The light held its place while the lake moved beneath it. Several minutes passed. Grant became aware that he had abandoned the reason he had come. His line remained unprepared. The tackle bag was still closed. He had stopped feeling the cold in his hands because all his attention had narrowed to the object offshore. At 5:24 a.m., it began to descend. There was no warning. The brightness did not increase. The shape did not tilt. It simply moved downward in a slow, straight line. Grant raised the phone again, but the small screen made the change difficult to judge. He lowered it almost at once and watched directly. The object continued toward the water. It did not drift with the wind or move towards either shore. The descent looked controlled and perfectly vertical, as though the rough surface below had no effect on its path. The lower edge reached the lake. Grant expected a splash. There was none. The white shape continued downward. For a brief moment, the upper portion remained visible above the waves while the lower part seemed to pass beneath them. The surrounding water did not rise around it. No spray appeared, no steam lifted into the cold air. Then the entire light went under. No splash. Grant stared at the place where it had disappeared. The lake continued, behaving as it had before. White caps formed and broke. Waves struck the rocks. Wind pushed ripples across the same area where the object had entered. There was no circular wake moving outward, no larger wave, no patch of foam. Nothing remained on the surface. Grant kept recording for several more minutes. The video showed darkness, rough water, and the sound of wind. It did not capture any clear disturbance after the light vanished. He scanned the lake for the object to return. Nothing rose from beneath the surface. No light appeared deeper in the water. No glow moved below the waves. The opposite shore remained dark, except for its ordinary lamps. Grant did not cast his line. He packed the unused equipment and stayed near the water until the sky began to brighten. As dawn spread across the lake, the place where the object had disappeared became easier to see, and no less ordinary. There was no buoy, no marker, no boat, no structure beneath the surface that Grant knew of. Later that morning, he returned to the shoreline and looked from several positions. In daylight, the distance offshore contained only open water. The lake charts he could access showed no fixed marker at that location. A boat light remained one possible answer. Distance, darkness, and rough conditions could have hidden a hull. A reflection might behave strangely depending on angle. The descent could have been an object moving away rather than moving down. Grant considered each explanation. What he could not fit into them was the stillness before the descent and the complete lack of reaction when the light reached the water. The wind had moved everything else. The waves had answered every rock, branch, and gust. But when the white object entered the lake, the surface gave no sign that anything had passed through it. Grant continued fishing at other places. He did not return to that shoreline before sunrise. Chapter 7. The Still Circle in the River. Callum had fished the same bend often enough to know how the river normally moved. The current was not strong, but it was steady. It carried leaves past the reeds, pulled lightly at his line, and formed small ripples around every stone breaking the surface. Near dusk, the water darkened to the color of glass, though it never became truly still. That evening was warm and windless. Callum stood alone on the bank, watching his float travel slowly downstream. Insects moved above the water. The soft rush of the current filled the gaps between distant bird calls. His line stopped. At first, he assumed the hook had caught on a branch or submerged rock. He lifted the rod and pulled gently. The line tightened. The float moved sideways, but the water around it did not respond. Callum watched more closely. The float had entered a smooth patch near the center of the bend. The area was roughly 6 or 7 feet across, with an almost circular boundary. Inside it, the surface looked flat and dark. Outside it, the river continued moving normally. Small ripples reached the edge and disappeared. The current flowed past both sides. Nothing entered the center. Callum lowered the tip of the rod and pulled the float back toward him. It slid through the still patch without making the narrow wake that usually followed it. No ring spread outward. No disturbance marked its path. The float moved as though it were crossing a solid pane rather than water. He let the line drift again. The current caught it as soon as the float passed beyond the boundary. Ripples returned around the plastic body, and the line began moving as downstream at once. Callum repeated the test. Inside the patch, stillness. Outside it, current. He moved several steps along the bank, changing his viewing angle. Reflections shifted across the rest of the river. The dark area stayed in the same place. It was not an illusion caused by where he stood. A mild eddy could create smoother water. Oil or pollen might form a film. The shape could have come from an underwater obstruction, changing the current beneath the surface. Yet Callum had never seen an eddy with such a clean edge. The river did not circle inside the patch. It did not rise, sink, or rotate. It simply stopped showing motion. He set the rod down. A few small pebbles lay near his boots. Callum picked up one no larger than the end of his thumb and tossed it toward the center. The pebble entered the dark surface with almost no sound. There was a tiny break where it struck, but no proper splash. No widening rings followed it. The water closed immediately and became smooth again. Callum waited for the pebble to disturb something beneath the surface. Nothing changed. He picked up a second stone and threw it outside the patch. This one struck with a clear splash. Ripples expanded across the current, stretched downstream, and broke against the edge of the smooth area. They did not continue through it. The difference was too sharp to ignore. Callum crouched near the bank and studied the boundary. There was no visible line on the water, no foam, plant matter, discoloration, or shadow marked where normal current ended. The division could only be seen through movement. On one side, the river behaved like a river. On the other, it did not. The sound around the bend began to change. The current remained audible upstream and downstream, but it seemed quieter near the dark patch. Insect noise above the water thinned. The effect was subtle enough that Callum could not tell whether the environment had changed or whether his attention had narrowed. He leaned closer. There was no light beneath the surface, no object, no visible animal. The water was dark, but clear enough near the edges for him to see stones below. Toward the center, the depth hid the bottom, as it always had. Callum lifted the rod again and guided the float directly across the patch. The line drew a slight curve in the moving water before reaching the boundary. The moment the float entered, the line stopped trembling. It continued sliding, silent, smooth, unresisted. When it crossed the far edge, small rings formed around it at once. The float dipped and rose as the current took hold again. Callum reeled it back more quickly. The same thing happened in reverse. Normal disturbance outside, nothing inside. He stopped testing the water. By then, the light was fading from the sky. Trees along the bank had become dark shapes. and the river beyond the bend was harder to follow. Callum had no wish to remain after full darkness. Before leaving, he watched the center of the patch for any sign of change. The first movement appeared near the outer edge. A faint ripple entered from the upstream side and traveled several inches before weakening. Another followed from the opposite side. The smooth boundary began losing its shape. The process was gradual. Normal water returned from the perimeter inward. Ripples crossed farther each time. The current began reaching into the center. Within less than a minute, the entire patch had rejoined the river around it. Nothing rose from beneath the surface. Nothing moved away. The still area simply ceased to exist. Callum picked up his equipment and left without casting again. He returned to the bend on other evenings. The current followed its usual path. Pebbles splashed, floats made wakes. Every part of the river reacted to contact. An eddy remained possible. So did an unusual layer of surface material or a change in pressure below the water. Callum had no measurements and no recording clear enough to preserve the boundary. What remained was a simple comparison. One stone struck moving water and produced a splash. Another entered the circle and barely disturbed it. For a short time, the river had contained a place where motion reached the edge and went no farther. Then the current closed over it. Chapter 8. The column in the empty school lot. The shortest route home cut across the grounds of an old school. The late shift worker had used it many times before. A narrow parking lot ran behind the building, bordered by a chain link fence, 2 basketball courts, and a row of weak light poles that left wide areas of asphalt in darkness. It was shortly after midnight. The school had been empty for hours. No vehicles remained near the entrances. The windows were black, and the nearest road could be heard beyond the buildings as a low, steady wash of traffic. Near the far fence, a white column stood on the pavement. It was narrow, perhaps 3 or 4 feet across, and rose beyond the height the witness could clearly judge. The upper end disappeared into darkness. No lamp, pole, cable, aircraft, or opening in the clouds could be seen above it. The light was not cast across the lot. It occupied one place. A small circle of asphalt was visible at its base, pale and sharply separated from the surrounding ground. Outside that circle, the parking area remained dim beneath the ordinary lamps. The witness slowed, but did not immediately turn away. A maintenance light was possible. Workers sometimes used portable lamps when repairing fences or drainage lines. A narrow spotlight from somewhere beyond the school might also have been striking mist or dust in the air, but there was no equipment nearby. No extension cord crossed the pavement. No generator ran behind the fence. The light did not widen as it reached the ground, or show the angled shape expected from a source positioned elsewhere. Dry leaves lay scattered across the lot. Inside the white column, several of them were rising. They did not spin violently or blow upward in a gust. Each leaf lifted slowly from the asphalt, turning in a loose circle as it climbed. Dust followed in thin strands. The air outside the light remained still. A leaf near the witness's shoe did not move. Another scraped once across the pavement and stopped. Within the column, the debris continued upward until it became too faint to see. Nothing fell back down. The witness moved closer. At approximately 20 feet, the traffic beyond the school seemed quieter. The footsteps on the asphalt also sounded softer than before, as though the open lot had begun absorbing their echoes. The light itself gave off no hum. It did not flicker. Its brightness rose and fell in a slow, shallow pulse, but the boundary remained stable. When the glow strengthened, the suspended leaves turned faster. When it weakened, they slowed without dropping. The witness stopped roughly 10 to 15 feet from the illuminated edge. Pressure formed inside both ears. It felt similar to a rapid change in altitude, though swallowing did not relieve it. A second pressure settled across the chest, or light at first, then firm enough to make each breath feel deliberate. The fingers of the right hand began to tingle. The witness raised that hand and watched it move. The motion felt delayed, not slow in the usual sense. The arm seemed to obey the decision, only after a small pause, as though thought and movement were no longer occurring at the same moment. The hand reached the expected position, but the action felt divided into two parts. The choice, then the movement. The witness stepped backward. Again, the body seemed to respond a fraction too late. The foot lifted after the intention to move had already passed through the mind. There was no dizziness and no loss of balance. The school building remained solid and correctly shaped. The fence did not bend. The weak lamps across the lot continued shining normally. Only the space near the column felt altered. The surrounding sounds had nearly disappeared. Traffic was no longer audible. Wind could not be heard against the fence. Even the witness's breathing seemed distant, reduced to pressure in the chest, rather than sound in the ears. Inside the column, the leaves climbed higher. A darker form passed through the light. It appeared near the upper visible section and moved downward. The shape was not solid enough to identify. It resembled a brief distortion, as though something had crossed behind a curtain of illuminated dust. The rising debris reacted to it. Leaves moved outward from the center, then returned to their slow spiral once the shadow had passed. The white column brightened. The pressure in the witness's ears increased sharply. Then the light ended. There was no fading edge and no shrinking beam. One instant, the column occupied the lot. The next, it did not. Every leaf that had been suspended above the pavement dropped at once. Gravity returned. The debris struck the asphalt in a scattered pattern. Several leaves landed flat. Dust settled slowly through the ordinary light from the nearby poles. Sound came back with equal speed. A vehicle passed beyond the school. Wind moved through the chain link fence. One of the basketball hoops gave a long metal creak. The witness stood in darkness where the edge of the column had been. There was no scorch mark on the pavement, no damp area, residue, broken surface, or damaged fence. The asphalt felt ordinary beneath the shoes. The pressure in the ears faded. The tingling in the fingers remained for less than a minute. The worker crossed the rest of the parking lot without stopping again. The movements no longer felt delayed, and the road beyond the school appeared exactly where it should. Only after reaching the opposite side did the witness check the phone. The display showed 1:18 a.m. That made no sense. The shortcut normally took only a few minutes. Even allowing time for standing near the column, the witness believed that very little time had passed. There had been no long period of confusion, no fall, and no awareness of remaining in the lot for more than an hour. The worker stared at the display. A moment later, the time changed to 1:19 a.m. The phone was functioning normally. Calls could be opened. The battery level looked unchanged. No unusual restart message or warning appeared. The clock continued forward from that point, without another error. The witness considered whether the original estimate of time had been wrong. A long shift could distort attention. The encounter might have lasted far longer than it seemed. The phone might have temporarily shown the wrong hour before correcting itself. A narrow spotlight could explain the light. Rising warm air might lift leaves and dust. Stress could create pressure, tingling, and the feeling that movement was delayed, yet the witness could not identify a source above the lot. An ordinary warm air did not seem enough to hold debris inside such a precise boundary. Most difficult of all was the missing interval between the short encounter that was remembered and the time shown afterward. The school lot looked normal the following night. Leaves moved with the wind. Traffic remained audible from one end to the other. Every lamp cast an ordinary pool of light onto the pavement. The worker never used the shortcut after midnight again. Chapter 9. The radio silence over the fields. The music disappeared halfway through a sentence. Wade Mercer was driving home after midnight. On a rural 2-lane road he had used for years, fields opened on both sides, broken by dark stretches of woodland and low fence lines. The road was empty, and his truck moved steadily beneath a clear sky. A late-night host had been speaking through the radio. Then there was nothing. No fading signal, no burst of static, no neighboring station bleeding into the frequency. The speaker became completely silent, while the engine, tires, and ventilation continued working normally. Wade pressed the tuning button. The display changed frequencies, but every band remained empty. Music, talk radio, weather reports, and emergency channels all produced the same absence. The station information vanished from the screen. Wade tapped the dashboard, once, expecting a loose connection to bring the sound back. It did not. Far ahead, and to his right, a white light stood above a field. At first, Wade assumed it belonged to farm equipment or a distant tower. It appeared roughly 20 feet above the ground, though darkness made the distance hard to judge. The light was bright enough to notice immediately, but did not illuminate the weeds, fence, or wet earth beneath it. It had no visible pole, no structure, no flashing marker. Wade continued driving. The object remained over the field as the road curved gently away from it. Its size did not change in the way he expected. It neither shrank with distance nor slid quickly across the side window. It simply held its place. Then the light vanished. The radio returned at the same instant. Music burst from the speakers at full volume, startling Wade enough that he turned it down. The station display reappeared, showing the frequency and song information as though nothing had interrupted it. He looked toward the field. Darkness. Wade considered pulling over, but the shoulder was narrow and soft from recent rain. He kept moving, telling himself he had seen a tower light, blocked by trees or a piece of machinery turning away. Several minutes later, the radio died again. This time, the light appeared beyond a nearer fence line. It was no longer far across the first field. It stood a few hundred yards from the road, brighter and easier to separate from the landscape. Wade could see tall weeds beneath it, yet the ground remained dark. The light did not seem to cast downward. It was visible without revealing anything around it. Wade slowed slightly. The road curved left through a patch of trees. Branches crossed his view, hiding the field for several seconds. When the road opened again, the object was still present. Its angle relative to the truck had barely changed. Wade increased his speed. The light stayed beside him. He reduced his speed again. Its apparent distance remained almost the same. A fixed farm light should have shifted backward as the truck moved. A vehicle traveling through the field might have matched his pace, but there was no second light, no engine noise, and no visible track running parallel to the road. The object seemed to correct its position without showing how. Wade watched it through short glances, unwilling to take his eyes from the road for long. Each time he looked away and returned, the light occupied a slightly different place, closer to the fence, farther above the weeds, nearer the road's next bend. He never saw it travel between those positions. The truck entered another wooded section. 2 dull taps struck the roof. Not loud, not sharp. The sound resembled 2 knuckles hitting thin metal from above. Wade ducked instinctively and looked toward the ceiling. No branch had crossed the road. There was no rain. No bird or loose debris appeared in the mirrors. A few seconds later, the dashboard clock began blinking. The numbers disappeared and were replaced by 12. The station display remained blank. Wade pressed the radio controls again. Nothing responded. The volume indicator did not appear, and the preset buttons produced no change. The engine never faltered. The headlights stayed steady. Whatever was happening seemed limited to information and sound. Wade reached another bend where a narrow entrance opened into the field. A metal gate stood back from the road, leaving enough space for the truck to turn around. For one moment, he considered entering. The light hovered beyond that gate. If it came from machinery, a tower, or someone working late, the turn would give him a clearer view. The object appeared close enough that he might finally see what supported it. Wade slowed. The light shifted. One instant, it was beyond the gate. The next, it stood farther along the field, aligned with the road ahead. No crossing movement, no gradual drift, only a corrected position. Wade passed the entrance without turning. The radio silence seemed deeper after that decision. He could still hear the tires on the pavement, but the sound felt distant. Even the engine seemed less present, as though the truck were moving through a layer of heavy air. The white light continued beside him. Wade spoke aloud, partly to test his own hearing. His voice sounded normal inside the cab. He repeated the road name and the direction home. He described the field, the fence, and the object in simple words, trying to keep his thoughts ordered. The dashboard clock still displayed 12. Another bend carried the road closer to the woods. The light vanished behind the tree line, and Wade felt a brief release. The radio did not return. He checked the mirrors. Nothing followed directly behind him. Then the white glow appeared ahead, on the opposite side of the road. Wade had not seen it cross. It now hovered above another field positioned beyond the left shoulder, at nearly the same apparent distance as before. The object was not following the road in any continuous way. It was appearing where it needed to be. Wade pressed harder on the accelerator. The truck gained speed. Fence posts passed more quickly in the headlights. The light remained level with the cab, neither falling behind nor pulling ahead. The road began climbing toward a low rise. From the top, Wade expected to see farm buildings, utility poles, or equipment that darkness had hidden. Instead, the landscape opened into empty fields. The white object hung alone. Its brightness never pulsed. Its edges did not flare. It looked almost modest against the wide darkness. Yet, its relationship to the moving truck made it impossible to dismiss. Wade continued toward the next intersection. A pair of headlights appeared far ahead. An oncoming car. The moment those headlights became visible, the truck's radio erupted into static. Music followed half a second later. The station display returned. The dashboard clock showed 1:43 a.m. Wade looked toward the field. The white light was gone. The oncoming car passed him normally. Its headlights swept across the fence, wet grass, and trees. For a few seconds, the entire roadside became visible. There was nothing in the field. No tower, no vehicle, no person carrying a lamp. The road noise felt suddenly loud inside the truck. Air moved through the vents. The radio host continued speaking without mentioning an outage or interruption. Wade drove the rest of the way home without changing stations. He could not determine how long the encounter had lasted. The clock had failed during part of it, and his sense of distance no longer felt reliable. He remembered every bend and every appearance of the light, but not how much time lay between them. The next day, Wade returned to both fields. Sunlight exposed the ground clearly. The first location contained only low weeds, fence posts, and open soil. No power line crossed it. No building stood beyond the visible rise. The nearer field was equally empty. There were no portable lamps, irrigation towers, parked vehicles, or recent tracks leading toward the places where the light had appeared. The gate remained closed, and mud near the entrance showed no fresh tire marks. Wade checked the road for branches that might have struck the truck roof. Nothing reached over the pavement. He later inspected the metal above the cab and found no dent, scrape, or residue where the two taps had sounded. A radio can lose reception on an isolated road. A dashboard display can reset because of a brief electrical fault. A distant tower or farm light can appear to move when a vehicle follows, bends through uneven ground. Those explanations remained possible. They did not explain why the radio returned whenever the light disappeared, why the object reappeared closer without visible travel, or why every normal display came back as another vehicle approached. Wade found no source in daylight, only two empty fields. After that night, any brief break in a radio signal made him look away from the dashboard and toward the land beside the road. Mid-video interlude. If you are still awake, we have reached the middle of tonight's encounters. So far, the stories have moved from distant lights into events that also touched radios, clocks, water, sound, and the spaces people thought they knew. If these quiet accounts are helping you unwind, you can like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the story still ahead. You can also leave a brief thought about which detail has been hardest to explain. Now the road opens west of Amarillo, where one light remained beside a moving truck for hours and across state lines. Chapter 10. The Light That Crossed State Lines. For 8 years, Shane Dougherty had measured nights by distance. A long-haul route was never only a line between two cities. It was fuel stops, way stations, changes in pavement, familiar towers, and the quiet judgment of how far a light truly stood from the highway. Driving through darkness had taught him which objects appeared to follow a truck, and which ones only seemed to. That experience was why the light west of Amarillo caught his attention. Shane was hauling produce east. The road ahead stretched through low scrubland, with only scattered lamps breaking the horizon. He was traveling at approximately 65 miles per hour when a steady white point appeared low to his left. It looked distant, not high enough to be an ordinary star, yet not obviously connected to the ground. Shane first placed it somewhere beyond the roadside scrub, perhaps near a tower or property far from the highway. He watched it through the side of the windshield. The light stayed at nearly the same angle. That alone meant little. A distant object can seem fixed when a vehicle is moving toward it. Drivers see the effect constantly, with the moon, bright planets, and towers many miles away. Shane increased his speed toward 70 miles per hour. The light did not slide backward. He later reduced his speed toward 55. It did not gain ground or change size. The road curved gradually, enough that a fixed lamp should have shifted across the glass. Instead, the white point seemed to remain beside the route, low over the land, and separated from every other visible light. There was no flashing pattern, no red marker, no broad glow against the ground. Shane adjusted his posture and leaned toward the passenger side. Reflections from the instrument panel shifted across the windshield. The white point did not. He lowered the brightness of the dashboard. It remained. He cracked the window and looked through the open space, removing the glass entirely from his line of sight. The light was still there. A voice came through the citizens' band radio from another truck several miles ahead. Shane answered, partly because ordinary conversation helped him check his own alertness. They exchanged locations and road conditions. Shane asked whether the other driver could see a steady light, low over the scrubland. The reply was uncertain. The driver could see several distant lights, but nothing that seemed unusual. The trucks were separated by enough distance and angle that they might not have shared the same view. Shane did not press the subject. Fatigue could create patterns where none existed. A driver staring through darkness for hours might misjudge distance, especially across flat land with few landmarks. Shane knew that, and treated the light as an ordinary roadside object for as long as he could. Then he reached a rest area. He turned off the highway, parked beneath weak lamps, and shut down the engine. The cab settled into silence as the vibration faded from the steering wheel and seat. Shane stepped onto the gravel. The white point remained beyond the open land. Without the moving truck, it should have become easier to understand. A tower would remain fixed against nearby ground features. An aircraft would continue across the sky. A reflection would have disappeared with the windshield behind him. The light gave him none of those answers. It held the same low position and seemed almost the same distance away. Shane walked several yards from the truck. Gravel shifted beneath his boots. Other parked vehicles stood farther down the rest area, their lights off and curtains closed. The surrounding world looked normal. The white point waited beyond it. After several minutes, Shane returned to the cab. The delivery schedule left little room for a long stop, and standing outside had not made the object any clearer. He merged back onto the highway. The light returned to its place beside him. Miles passed. Terrain changed slowly from open scrub to wider dark stretches where even distant buildings disappeared. Shane watched road signs approach and fall behind. He crossed junctions, adjusted lanes, and followed bends that altered his view of the horizon. The object's apparent relation to the truck remained strangely consistent. At times, it seemed farther ahead. After Shane glanced at a mirror or checked the instruments, it would appear to occupy another position. He never caught it moving between those places. It was simply there again. The radio began producing brief bursts of static. The interruptions were not constant. They arrived without warning, roughening voices and music for several seconds before clearing. Shane changed stations and heard the same short disturbances across different frequencies. The engine continued normally. Headlights remained steady. Nothing suggested a wider electrical failure. At a fuel stop, Shane parked beneath a brightly lit canopy and filled the truck. The white point was difficult to see through the stronger lights around the station. Yet, when he walked toward the darker edge of the lot, he found it again beyond the highway. Still low, still separate from the ground. By then, the encounter had continued long enough that ordinary explanations were becoming less comfortable. A planet could appear to follow a driver for hours. Its position would remain steady across enormous distances. But this light seemed too low, and it occasionally changed its place relative to the road without crossing the space between. A tower might remain visible over many miles in flat country. Yet a tower light should eventually reveal a structure, change angle, or disappear behind terrain. A reflection should not remain visible outside the truck Fatigue could explain the uncertainty. It could not easily explain the repeated checks. Shane crossed state lines with the light still present. He tried to stop watching it. For several miles, he concentrated only on the lane, mirrors, and instrument readings. When he finally looked toward the horizon again, the point had moved farther ahead and slightly left. There had been no visible flight, no streak, no gradual change. Another placement. The dashboard clock became difficult to follow. Shane would note the time, return his attention to the road, and later feel unsure whether 10 minutes or nearly an hour had passed. The display appeared normal whenever he examined it closely. Yet the sequence of the night no longer felt smooth. Road signs remained his better measure. Town names changed. Exit numbers advanced. The distance continued beneath the wheels. The light stayed near the deepest part of the night, with traffic reduced to rare pairs of headlights. Shane spoke toward the windshield. "Just go away." The words sounded smaller than he expected inside the large cab. The light gave no response. For a time, it seemed to fall behind the truck. Shane felt a cautious sense of relief and refused to look directly toward it again. Several miles later, the white point appeared ahead, not sweeping forward, not passing above him, simply waiting in a different part of the horizon. Around 4 a.m., Shane was moving through eastern New Mexico. The first hint of dawn had begun forming behind the land, faint enough that the sky remained mostly black, but clear enough to weaken the stars. Ordinary lights changed under that growing brightness. Far lamps lost their sharp edges. Stars near the horizon disappeared. A tower marker became easier to connect with the dark structure beneath it. The white point remained unchanged. Its brightness did not seem stronger, but it resisted the dawn longer than the other lights around it. It stood low and clean against the paling sky. Shane watched it through several more changes of direction. The object began appearing farther ahead in a series of distinct positions. Each placement held for a while. Then Shane would look back and find it somewhere else. There was never a visible path. The final position was ahead and left of the truck. The sky behind it began taking on the first true color of morning. Deep gray softened into a narrow band of cold blue. Shapes returned to the land. Fences, low ridges, and distant structures separated themselves from the darkness. The light began to fade. It did not rise or accelerate away. Its brightness weakened evenly, as though the approaching day were slowly removing it from view. For several minutes, Shane could still find the point by returning to the same place above the horizon. Then it became too faint to separate from the morning sky. There was no final movement, only absence. By the time sunlight reached the road, the encounter had stretched across several hours. Multiple stops, speed changes, lane changes, changing terrain, and state upward lines. Shane could not prove that the light had remained with his truck. A planet, fatigue, distant towers, and mistaken perspective all remained possible. What troubled him was the scale of the comparison. He had not judged it during one brief glance. He had watched it while driving fast and slow, while parked with the engine off, while standing outside the cab, and while crossing a distance large enough to change the landscape around him. Everything else moved as expected. The light did not. It stayed until dawn made staying impossible. Chapter 11. The light that came closer each night. By the time Damon Price began expecting the light, he had already spent several nights trying to forget it. His shift ran from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. inside a 4-story office building that became almost entirely empty after the cleaning staff left. The work was repetitive. Damon checked doors, watched security screens, walked the same corridors, and recorded anything unusual in a paper log. Most nights gave him nothing to write down. The rear of the property faced a narrow strip of scrubland. A chain-link fence marked the edge of the parking lot, followed by a drainage ditch and low weeds that disappeared into darkness. Beyond that lay unused ground and a few distant industrial buildings. Shortly after 3 a.m., Damon usually made a round through the first floor. On the first night, he glanced through the back doors and noticed a white light beyond the fence. It stood low over the scrub, far enough away to seem unimportant. Damon assumed it belonged to construction equipment, a yard lamp, or a vehicle parked beyond the drainage ditch. He checked the wall clock. It was approximately 3:03 a.m. The light remained visible for several minutes. It did not blink or sweep across the ground. From inside the building, it looked like a distant white point with slightly softened edges. Damon continued his round. When he returned to the doors later, the light was gone. Nothing about the first appearance seemed worth reporting. The second night changed that. At nearly the same time, Damon saw the white point again. Its height looked unchanged. Its brightness was also the same. It waited beyond the rear fence, in almost the exact place he remembered. Damon checked the outdoor cameras. The rear feeds showed the fence, parking spaces, and part of the drainage area. On one screen, the light appeared as a weak smear. Near the edge of the image, another camera showed almost nothing. The object was clearer through the glass than on the monitors. He stepped outside. Cold air moved lightly across the lot. Ventilation units hummed on the roof. A vehicle passed on the distant road. The white point remained beyond the fence. Damon watched for several minutes before returning inside. It had offered no movement, sound, or obvious threat. The next night, it came back. Again, the wall clock read close to 3:03 a.m. Damon began noting the time in his personal notebook, though he left it out of the official security log. He did not want to explain a distant light that might prove to be ordinary. The pattern continued. Some nights, the object appeared a minute before 3:03. On others, it arrived slightly after. The difference was small enough that Damon began organizing his rounds around it. By 2:55 a.m., he would already be on the first floor. He told himself he was testing the pattern. In truth, he was waiting. The light remained difficult to record. The security cameras reduced it to a pale mark, without shape. When Damon used binoculars, the object became larger, but no clearer. Its surface looked smooth and blank, as though the magnification had brought it closer without revealing any detail. There were no visible lamps around it, no support pole, no vehicle beneath it. During the first week, Damon believed the light was fixed in one location. Then he compared it with the fence. A leaning metal post stood near the drainage ditch. Several yards farther along, one section of chain link had been repaired with newer wire. Damon used those features as reference points. The object was not returning to exactly the same place. Each night, it appeared slightly nearer. The changes were small, a few feet perhaps. Sometimes the shift was sideways, as well as forward. Damon never watched it travel between positions. It disappeared before dawn. The next night, it returned somewhere else. He began marking the positions on a rough sketch of the property. The points formed an uneven line from the distant scrub toward the rear lot. A construction lamp should have remained tied to a work site. A vehicle should have left tracks, changed angle, or moved during the night. This light seemed to approach through separate placements. Damon stopped looking forward to 3:03 a.m. The final night began without anything unusual. He completed the first rounds, checked the stairwells, and watched several employees leave after working late. By 2:50 a.m., the building was quiet. Damon remained near the rear security desk. At 3:03 a.m., the light appeared. It was no longer beyond the distant scrub. The object hovered roughly 30 yards past the parking lot, just beyond the fence and drainage ditch. It stood only 10 to 12 feet above the wet weeds. At that distance, Damon could judge its size more clearly. It was about as large as a beach ball, perhaps slightly larger. The surface gave off a dull white glow. It was not transparent, and it did not resemble a lamp shining outward. The light seemed held within the object, strong enough to define its round form, but too weak to illuminate the area beneath it properly. Wet grass should have reflected the glow. The fence should have cast a shadow. Neither did. Damon checked the monitors. The rear cameras flickered. One feed briefly broke into horizontal bands before returning. Another image froze on the empty fence line, then jumped forward without showing what had happened during the missing interval. The object remained visible through the doors. Damon picked up his radio and stepped outside. The first few yards felt normal. His shoes made soft sounds against the pavement. Air moved through the weeds. The distant road produced its usual low hum. Halfway across the lot, the background noise weakened. The ventilation system faded first, then the road. By the time Damon reached the final row of parking spaces, the building behind him seemed far away, despite being only a short distance back. The object held its position. He could now see that its outline was not perfectly circular. The lower part appeared slightly wider, although the shape seemed to change when he tried to focus on it. The radio released a brief burst of static. Damon raised it toward his mouth but did not speak. A pressure settled around him, similar to the feeling before a storm. His ears tightened. The skin across his arms prickled beneath his uniform. The shadows near the fence began to look wrong. Light from the building should have placed them away from the doors. Instead, parts of the fence seemed dark on both sides. Several weeds cast thin shadows at angles that did not match either the building lights or the object. Damon remained at the edge of the lot. The object did not advance. It did not retreat. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then the pale surface brightened slightly. Damon took one step backward. The radio crackled again. He took another step. The air near the doors felt easier to breathe. Behind him, the security lights cast a clean rectangle across the floor inside the building. Damon placed one foot over the threshold. The object vanished. No fading, no upward movement, no dark shape leaving the ditch. One moment, it hovered above the weeds. The next, there was only the empty fence line. The building's ventilation returned in a single low rush. Traffic became audible again. Damon's radio produced a clear channel tone. He stepped fully inside and unlocked the door. For several minutes, he watched the place where the object had been. Nothing appeared in the scrub. The weeds moved normally in the night air. Damon reviewed the security recordings. The exact timing was difficult to establish because the system clock and the clip labels did not align cleanly. What remained was a brief flicker, followed by a short missing interval on the rear cameras. Before the gap, the fence was visible. After it, the fence was still visible. The recording contained no clear image of the object disappearing, only an absence between two ordinary frames. Damon inspected the drainage ditch after sunrise. He found no flattened weeds, heat damage, footprints, equipment, or tire marks. The ground beneath the object's final position looked no different from the rest of the strip. A distant work light could explain the earliest appearances. Camera faults were common enough in older security systems. Watching the same place night after night might have made small differences in perspective feel like movement, but those explanations became harder to accept once the light was 30 yards away, hanging 10 to 12 feet above the ground. Damon continued working at the building for several more weeks. The light never returned. Even so, his body kept following the routine it had learned. Near 3 a.m., he would find himself moving toward the back doors before remembering there was no longer anything to see. He always checked the clock, then the fence, always in that order. Chapter 12: The Distortion Above the Hangar. Daniel Rios had been making deliveries to the desert base for almost a year. Twice each week, he drove an aviation fuel truck through the same empty stretch of road and waited outside the north checkpoint until security cleared him. The delays varied, but the place rarely did. Floodlights burned along the perimeter. Low buildings stood behind wire and concrete. The larger hangars remained dark, unless a crew was working late. That routine gave Daniel a clear sense of what belonged there. Shortly after midnight in late August, he parked in the usual holding area and switched off the engine. The heat remained trapped in the ground and metal around him. The air was dry, windless, and still warm enough that Daniel left the window partly open. Above the base, the sky was completely clear. He could see stars from one horizon to the other. While waiting for the checkpoint light to change, Daniel noticed a wavering patch above one of the distant hangars. At first, he took it for heat rising from the roof. Desert buildings released warmth long after sunset, and exhaust from equipment could bend light in ways that made straight edges appear unstable. Daniel had seen that effect many times. This patch was different. It did not rise from the roof in loose waves. The distortion occupied a defined area roughly 50 feet above the hangar. Stars behind it stretched, bent, and slid sideways before returning to their normal shape beyond the boundary. Daniel watched for several seconds. The effect remained in place. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his shirt. Dust collected quickly in the cab, and a smear on one lens could easily create a false blur. When he put them back on, the distortion was unchanged. A group of stars behind it appeared to tremble, as though viewed through moving water. Stars outside the affected area stayed sharp. Daniel shifted in his seat. The patch altered slightly with his angle, but it did not disappear. So it had depth and position beyond the windshield. He lowered the window completely. The same warped section of sky remained above the hangar. The longer he studied it, the less it resembled ordinary heat shimmer. Heat usually created irregular movement that weakened with height. This distortion looked bounded. Its outer edge was difficult to see directly, but the stars revealed where it began and ended. Inside that area, the sky moved. Outside it, the night remained still. Daniel checked his phone. It was 12:17 a.m. No message had arrived from security. The checkpoint lane remained closed. He opened the door and stepped down from the cab. The hot pavement gave off a faint smell of dust and oil. There was no wind against his face. Nothing moved along the fence, and no vehicles crossed the open ground between the checkpoint and the hangars. From outside, the distortion seemed larger. It no longer appeared 50 feet above the building. Perspective had changed enough for Daniel to place it only 10 to 15 feet above the hangar roof. The affected section stretched wider than the building itself. He walked several steps along the side of the truck, using the hangar corners as reference points. The warped stars shifted against the roofline in a way that suggested a curved surface, not a cloud, not smoke, something broad enough to alter the light behind it. Daniel could not see a solid object. There was no clear underside, outline, or reflection. The shape existed only through the sky, bending around it. He listened. No rotor beat crossed the base. No engine idled near the hangar. There was no exhaust noise, rushing air, or mechanical hum that might explain a large aircraft hovering above the roof. The desert remained quiet. A row of security lamps ran along the hangar wall. Daniel noticed that those lights appeared dimmer than the lamps on nearby buildings. The bulbs themselves had not gone out. Their glow simply seemed reduced, as though some of the light had been absorbed or blocked before reaching him. He compared the buildings carefully. The hangar beneath the distortion looked subdued. The maintenance building beside it remained bright. Daniel began considering explanations in order. A temperature layer could bend starlight. Heated air from vents might rise above the roof. A transparent exhaust plume could distort the sky without producing visible smoke, but he could not see open vents, operating machinery, or any movement along the building. The effect also seemed too broad and too stable for a narrow flow of hot air. He watched one bright star enter the distorted region as the sky slowly turned. Its point stretched into a short arc, then it divided. For a moment, Daniel appeared to see two weaker versions of the same star. As the star passed beyond the affected area, the 2 points merged and became sharp again. The distortion did not move with the star. The star moved through it. That detail made Daniel stop thinking of the effect as a patch of cloud. Something was occupying a fixed volume above the hangar. His phone vibrated. A message from the dispatcher asked whether the delivery had been cleared. Daniel looked down long enough to type a brief reply. When he raised his eyes again, the distortion had begun contracting. The outer sections narrowed toward the center. Stars near the edges returned to normal first. The broader, wavering shape became smaller, denser, and more difficult to track. Daniel stepped farther from the truck. The security lights beneath it began brightening. Not suddenly. Their full strength returned in the same gradual way. The warped sky was clearing. The final section of distortion hovered above the center of the roof. For a second, the affected stars seemed to curve around an invisible oval. Then the sky became clear. Every point returned to its proper place. Daniel kept watching the empty space. The hangar doors began to close. The movement was slow and heavy. Two large sections drew together across the opening until they met in the middle. Daniel felt certain the doors had already been shut when he arrived. He had seen no aircraft enter. He had heard no machinery begin. If something had been inside the hangar, he could not explain why the doors moved only after the distortion above the roof had disappeared. The wall lights were now as bright as the others across the base. A security vehicle approached the checkpoint. The lane signal changed, and Daniel received permission to continue with the delivery. He completed the work without mentioning what he had seen. At the time, silence seemed easier than trying to describe an object that had never fully appeared. Daniel continued visiting the base. On later nights, he checked the same hangar before leaving the cab. The stars above it remained sharp. Heat shimmer rose naturally from roofs and pavement, loose and uneven, never one curved boundary, high above a building. He could not rule out an unusual optical effect. Hot air, distant exhaust, and layers of desert atmosphere can bend light in surprising ways. The dim, security lamps may have been an error of perspective. The timing of the closing doors may have meant nothing at all. Yet ordinary heat does not usually make stars seem to pass behind a single invisible form. Daniel had seen no craft, only the place where one might have been. In the next account, the strange movement near a restricted boundary would not appear in the sky. It would be measured beneath the ground. Chapter 13. The pulse beneath the restricted boundary. The first signal was too clean to look natural. At approximately 6:20 a.m., an unnamed seismic surveyor was reviewing baseline readings from a line of ground sensors placed across a dry stretch of desert. The work was routine. The instruments were meant to capture the small vibrations that constantly moved through the land. Wind produced uneven noise. Distant trucks created shallow waves through the soil. Temperature changes, loose cables, footsteps, and minor ground shifts all left their own imperfect marks. The spike on the screen looked different. It rose sharply, held a narrow shape, and fell back to the baseline without the rough edges common to natural movement. There was no tremor beneath the surveyor's feet, and no sound from the surrounding land. He marked the time and continued watching. Exactly 3 minutes later, the signal returned. The second pulse matched the first closely enough to look copied. The height was the same. So was the width. The rise and fall followed nearly identical lines. 3 minutes passed. A third pulse appeared. The surveyor checked the nearest sensor before the next interval arrived. Its anchor was secure. The cable showed no visible damage. Dust had gathered around the base without any sign that the equipment had shifted during the night. The fourth pulse came on schedule. He disconnected and reattached the cable. The fifth arrived exactly 3 minutes later. A repeating signal did not automatically suggest anything unusual. Pumps, generators, drilling systems, and other machines often produced steady rhythms through the ground. Even traffic could repeat at regular intervals if vehicles were moving through a controlled site, but there was no active road close enough to explain the strength. The nearest work vehicles were parked. Nothing visible on the desert surface moved in time with the readings. The surveyor carried a second unit farther from the first and placed it directly into the ground. If the original sensor was faulty, the independent instrument should remain quiet. It did not. Both sensors recorded the next pulse. The timing matched. The strength differed only slightly. He checked calibration, inspected the connectors again, and walked the survey line looking for loose equipment or buried utilities. The restricted boundary lay in the distance, marked by fencing and signs he was not permitted to approach. Whatever was creating the signal seemed to come from that direction. The surveyor contacted his supervisor, Danvers. Danvers arrived later that morning and studied several cycles on the monitor. He watched the pulse appear, waited through the 3-minute gap, then watched the next one rise in the same shape. Equipment interference, he said. The surveyor pointed out that 2 separate units were recording the sequence. A shared electrical problem was possible, but the instruments were independently powered and placed apart from one another. Danvers repeated the practical checks. Cables, anchors, calibration, nearby vehicles. No clear fault appeared. Even so, the internal explanation remained unchanged. Equipment interference. The signal continued throughout the day. It did not speed up when the desert warmed. It did not weaken when the wind increased. Passing vehicles added their own rough vibrations to the record, yet the clean pulse remained visible beneath them at the same 3-minute interval. By the second day, the surveyor noticed another feature. Each event contained 2 parts. The first was the larger spike he had already been tracking. Approximately half a second later, a smaller pulse followed. The second response was weaker, but equally consistent. It appeared after every main signal with the same short delay. A machine operating above ground might create a primary vibration, followed by an echo through another layer of soil or rock. A buried system could also produce paired movements, but the surveyor had no map showing active equipment beneath that section of desert. He began comparing sensors at different points along the line. The instruments nearer the restricted boundary would have recorded slightly stronger pulses. Those farther away showed weaker versions of the same pattern. That suggested a source. It did not yet suggest movement. To test the direction more carefully, the surveyor arranged 3 sensors with enough distance between them to compare arrival times. Their clocks were synchronized, and the units were checked against one another before the next cycle. The pulse reached the first sensor. A fraction later, it reached the second. Then the third. 3 minutes afterward, the same order repeated. The differences were small, but they were stable. Over several cycles, the arrival times began to change. The first sensor no longer led by exactly the same amount. The second slowly gained on it, while the third received the pulse later than before. The source was not remaining in one place. According to the instruments, it was moving beneath or through the survey area. Slowly, steadily, in a straight line. There were no turns, stops, or bursts of speed. The calculated movement remained constant from one 3-minute event to the next. Nothing crossed the surface, no dust rose, no heavy vehicle appeared along the fence. The desert above the readings remained empty. Danvers reviewed the newer data and showed little interest in the inferred path. He suggested that a shared timing fault might create the illusion of travel between sensors. The surveyor checked the clocks again. They remained synchronized. He swapped 2 units and repeated the test. The pulse still moved through the line in the same physical direction, rather than following one specific instrument. A natural tremor would not normally repeat with mechanical precision for so many hours. Traffic should have varied in strength and interval. Drilling might create a steady rhythm, but the source appeared to travel while preserving the same paired waveform. The surveyor continued recording. 1 unit was left active overnight. The pulse crossed the dark hours without changing its spacing. Every 3 minutes, the main signal rose from the baseline. Half a second later, the weaker response followed. The sequence remained intact past midnight. At 2:15 a.m., the sensor recorded another normal pair. At 2:18 a.m., it recorded the next. Then nothing. The pulse did not weaken first. The 3-minute interval did not lengthen. There was no final burst, slowdown, or change in shape. The sequence simply ended. Morning wind added light noise to the record. A distant vehicle created a broad vibration. The exact paired signal did not return. Later that day, access to the survey area was restricted. The assignment was ended earlier than expected. The witness was told that the equipment would be collected by another team and that no further measurements were required near the boundary. When he asked how the repeating pulse would be listed, Danvers gave the same answer. That's the classification. I hate your equipment interference. The surveyor attempted to review the files afterward. The anomalous sequence was no longer available in the project folder. In its place was a cleaner set of baseline data without the repeating spikes, changing arrival times, or overnight ending at 2:18 a.m. There was no written explanation for the replacement. The surveyor had no independent authority to challenge the classification. He could not prove what had moved beneath the sensors, or even whether the source had been underground rather than somewhere beyond the boundary. A buried machine remained possible. So did a technical fault shared across the equipment. Yet a fault would have needed to reproduce the same pulse at exact 3-minute intervals, add a second response half a second later, change its arrival time across 3 separated sensors, and then stop without warning after hours of steady repetition. The desert had shown nothing. The instruments had recorded movement. By the time the records were cleaned, even that movement was gone. Chapter 14. The seconds missing from every camera. Martin was waiting near the front gate when Elliot stepped outside the following morning. The retired man lived 2 doors away and usually kept their conversations brief. A comment about the weather, a complaint about bins left too close to the pavement, a few words about repairs being done somewhere along the street. This time, he looked tired. "Lights just sitting there," Martin said. Elliot followed his gaze toward the roof of his own house. Nothing was there now. Only television antennas, pale morning cloud, and the familiar line of semi-detached homes stretching down the street. Martin explained that he had been awake after midnight when 3 faint lights appeared above Elliot's roof. They had not crossed the sky or blinked like an aircraft. They remained in one position, separated from one another for at least a couple of minutes. No sound didn't move like that. Martin lifted one hand and drew a slow line through the air, showing what he meant by normal movement. Whatever he had watched had not followed that path. Elliot asked whether the lights might have been stars. Martin shook his head. Cloud had covered much of the sky, and the points had seemed lower than the cloud layer. He was also certain they were positioned over the house, rather than far beyond it. The account sounded strange, but not impossible to dismiss. Reflections could appear in upstairs windows. A distant aircraft could seem motionless while approaching directly. 3 bright stars might become visible through a break-in cloud. Martin had viewed the scene from another property and could easily have misjudged the angle. Elliot told him there had been no noise or disturbance inside the house. Then he remembered the camera. A simple, motion-activated unit faced the front path from beside the door. It did not record continuously, but passing pedestrians, animals, changing headlights, and even large insects sometimes triggered short clips. Elliot opened the camera application on his phone. Most of the night looked ordinary. A cat crossed the path before midnight. Headlights moved across the parked cars. A delivery van passed along the road much later than expected. Each recording contained a clear beginning and ending. One clip stood apart. Its timestamp was approximately 12:47 a.m. The image showed the empty front path and part of the street. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then the exposure changed abruptly, brightening the walls and washing the sky into a lighter shade of gray. The picture flickered. The recording jumped forward. 5 or 6 seconds were missing. Elliot replayed it. Before the break, a branch near the edge of the frame leaned slightly toward the road. Afterward, it had moved farther back. A distant car was visible in one position, and then appeared several yards ahead, without being recorded, crossing the space between. The clip had not frozen on one frame. Time itself had been removed from the file. There was no image of 3 lights. Elliot checked the next recording. At approximately 1:03 a.m., the same pattern appeared again. An empty street, a brief change in exposure, a flicker, then another gap lasting roughly 5 to 6 seconds. The earlier recordings were continuous. Their timestamps progressed normally, and no similar fault appeared during the evening. Elliot downloaded the 2 clips and viewed them on a larger screen. The missing intervals remained. He slowed the playback and moved through it 1 frame at a time. Immediately before each gap, the brightness rose across the entire image. Immediately afterward, the scene returned to its previous level. Nothing entered the frame. No person crossed the path. No vehicle stopped outside the house. No beam or object appeared above the roof. The camera had preserved only the interruption. Elliot remembered that a second unit covered the rear garden. Its angle included the back fence, part of the kitchen extension, and a narrow section of sky. The system was less sensitive there because fewer people passed through the area. He opened the rear recordings. A clip from around the same period showed the garden under weak security lighting. The image flickered and several seconds vanished. Another short recording contained a similar break. The front and rear cameras were separate devices. They covered opposite sides of the house and responded to different motion zones. Both were connected to the same home network, but each stored its own clips. A software fault could still affect them together. A brief network interruption might delay data. An update could cause both devices to restart. Automatic changes in exposure sometimes produced visible flicker, especially under cloud or passing headlights. But a network problem should not normally remove the same kind of short interval from completed local recordings. Elliot asked Martin to describe the lights again, without mentioning the camera faults. Martin placed them above the roof in a loose triangle. They were faint, not bright enough to light the tiles or nearby walls. He had watched long enough to decide they were not moving with the clouds. They disappeared while he was looking away briefly toward his kitchen. He could not give the exact minute. The lights may have been present during one of the recorded gaps. They may also have appeared between the camera clips. There was no way to prove the events belonged together. That evening, Elliot checked the cameras repeatedly. The street remained quiet. Cars passed. A neighbor returned home. The front unit recorded each movement without difficulty. After midnight, the image flickered again. Elliot was watching the live feed when it happened. The screen brightened and briefly became unresponsive. When the picture returned, the street looked unchanged. He went to the front window. No lights were visible above the roof or anywhere else in the sky. A new clip appeared in the application several minutes later. It contained another short gap. The rear camera had done the same. Elliot stepped closer to the window and placed his hand against the glass. The center of the pane felt warm, not hot enough to hurt, and not evenly heated. One small section carried a mild warmth that faded while he kept his palm against it. The room behind him was cool, and no radiator stood near the window. He moved his head slightly. For an instant, the reflection in the glass seemed displaced. The hallway light and the darker room behind it appeared to sit at different depths, as if the surface had shifted between them. Then the reflection looked normal. Elliot inspected the frame and seals. He found no electrical cable, heated element, crack, or source that could explain the warm patch. Condensation had not formed anywhere on the glass. Those details were uncertain. A hand can misjudge temperature. Reflections change with viewing angle. Stress makes ordinary things feel connected. The camera gaps were harder to set aside. Elliot restarted the system, updated the software, and checked the network history. Nothing showed a clear failure at the relevant times. The devices worked correctly during the day. Martin asked about the recordings later. Elliot told him the cameras had glitched It was easier than explaining what the files contained. He did not mention that both sides of the house had lost similar pieces of time. He did not describe the warm glass or the brief shift in reflection. Without an image of the lights, those details felt too weak to carry beyond the room where they happened. The gaps stopped after the second night. The cameras returned to their usual faults: missed motion, delayed notifications, blurred insects near the lens, nothing that removed a clean section from the middle of a clip. Elliot never found a photograph of the 3 lights Martin had watched. The evidence was shaped like absence: several seconds before, several seconds after, nothing between them. And the next missing interval would not belong to a camera. It would belong to a driver who remained conscious before and after 8 minutes that left no memory behind. Chapter 15. The 8 minutes between 2 mile markers. The desert light had begun to flatten. When the driver checked the dashboard clock, he was heading north on Nevada's extraterrestrial highway in a company truck, surrounded by pale ground, distant ridges, and long stretches of road with almost nothing close enough to judge distance against. The sun was still above the horizon, but evening had started draining the color from the land. The dashboard read 5:12 p.m. That seemed wrong. The radio display showed 5:04 p.m. His phone showed the same time. The driver assumed the truck clock had drifted. Company vehicles were used by several people, and their clocks were often left a few minutes fast or slow. An 8-minute error was not unusual enough to matter. He returned his attention to the road. Traffic was light. No vehicle followed closely behind, and only a few appeared in the opposite lane. Fence lines crossed the open land. Utility poles appeared in short groups and then vanished again. Several minutes later, the driver looked down. The dashboard still showed 5:12 p.m. The radio had advanced normally, so had the phone. He watched the truck clock for a few seconds, waiting for the minute to change. It remained fixed. The road ahead stayed clear, so he glanced between the 3 displays again. The dashboard changed, not to 5:13. It jumped directly to 5:20 p.m. At almost the same moment, the phone showed 5:12 p.m. The driver looked back at the truck clock. Its numbers flickered once and returned to 5:12. For a moment, all 3 devices seemed to disagree with one another. There was no loss of engine power. The radio continued playing. The phone remained connected and responsive. Nothing else inside the vehicle suggested an electrical fault. The driver tapped the dashboard near the clock. The display held steady. He had driven the route before and knew the mile markers well enough to use them as a separate measure. The road might look empty, but the numbered signs gave it a reliable rhythm. Mile marker 167 passed on the right. He noticed it clearly. The next stretch of road seemed normal. A shallow rise, open desert, a faded fence running parallel to the shoulder. Then mile marker 169 appeared. The driver slowed slightly. Marker 168. It was not there. He searched the rearview mirror, expecting to see the missing sign behind him. The road curved gently, and the marker was already hidden by distance and angle. Perhaps he had simply failed to notice it. That happened. A driver could look at a mirror, adjust the radio, or lose focus for a few seconds. 1 mile could pass without leaving a strong memory, especially on a road where each stretch resembled the last. But the driver could not remember anything between 167 and 169. Not a blurred sign, not a passing vehicle, not the shape of the road. The missing section did not feel forgotten. It felt absent. He pulled onto the shoulder. Dust lifted behind the truck and drifted toward the ditch. The engine idled normally while he checked the time again. The dashboard showed 5:20 p.m. The radio showed 5:12. The phone also showed 5:12. Then the dashboard flickered and returned to 5:12. The driver restarted neither the truck nor the phone. The clocks appeared to correct themselves without his help. He checked the trip meter. The distance showed that the truck had traveled the full 2 miles from marker 167 to marker 169. The fuel reading had also changed by an amount consistent with continued driving. Nothing suggested that the vehicle had stopped, reversed, or jumped physically from one place to another. The truck had crossed the missing mile. The driver had no experience of doing so. Marker 168. That was the gap. He stepped out of the cab. The highway extended in both directions under the fading light. Wind moved dust along the shoulder. A car passed, its tires producing a brief rise and fall of sound before the desert became quiet again. There was no unusual structure nearby, no side road, no damaged sign lying in the ditch, no place where roadwork might have removed a marker. The driver considered turning around. Company schedules, fuel limits, and the approaching darkness argued against it. More than that, he felt no certainty that returning immediately would explain anything. If the marker stood where it should, the experience would remain unchanged. He climbed back into the truck. Before pulling onto the road, he opened the phone clock and watched the seconds advance. The display behaved normally. The radio time also moved forward. The dashboards appeared stable. He resumed driving. At the next mile marker, he spoke the number aloud. 170. Then the next. 171. He continued naming them as they passed. The act felt unnecessary, but it gave the road a clear order again. Each marker arrived after the expected distance. None was skipped. The landscape remained ordinary. Nothing hovered above the desert. No bright object crossed the road. There was no pressure in the air, no radio silence, and no physical sensation that separated one moment from another. The only disturbance had been continuity itself. A short time later, the radio announcer gave the time. It was 5:22 p.m. The driver checked the dashboard. 5:22. The phone matched it. All 3 clocks were now synchronized. That result should have been reassuring. Instead, it created a sharper problem. If the earlier conflict had been a simple clock fault, why had 3 separate displays settled on the same time only after the unexplained gap? The driver continued north. He reached his destination without another unusual event. The rest of the route remained easy to remember, including stops, turns, and traffic. Later, he tried reconstructing the sequence. The first dashboard reading had been 5:12 p.m., while the radio and phone showed 5:04. The truck clock had then remained fixed, jumped to 5:20, and returned to 5:12. Mile marker 167 had been followed by 169. Afterward, the devices had eventually agreed at 5:22. The conflict covered 8 minutes, exactly the same amount by which the dashboard had first seemed wrong. Fatigue offered one explanation. The driver might have misread the numbers and missed marker 168 while his attention drifted. Memory does not record every mile of a familiar road, and monotonous driving can create brief periods of automatic behavior. A faulty dashboard clock could explain the changing display. It could not alter the radio or phone. nor could it account for the trip meter confirming the full distance, while the driver remembered no part of 1 mile. On a later journey, he watched carefully for marker 168. It stood where it should. The sign was upright and clearly visible from the road. The stretch between 167 and 169 contained no hidden junction, unusual dip, or feature that would make the marker easy to miss. The driver passed it in full daylight. Nothing happened. The clock stayed aligned. The road remained continuous. He understood that people forget things constantly. A distracted mind can lose details, and a tired driver may travel farther than expected without forming a clear memory. But forgotten time usually leaves fragments: a bend in the road, a sound from the radio, the sense of motion. These 8 minutes left none. There was no damaged memory to recover, only a clean absence between 2 mile markers, while the truck continued moving through a place the driver never experienced. Chapter 16. The road with too many shadows. The first shadow pointed toward the road. The second stretched across it. Mason Reed noticed both while driving home on a familiar county route after helping his cousin repair a damaged fence. The work had taken longer than expected, leaving him tired, cold, and eager to reach home. The road passed through pasture and narrow stands of trees. Mason knew every bend. He knew where deer sometimes crossed, where water gathered after rain, and where the pavement narrowed beside an old wooden fence. The sky was clear. There was no fog and no traffic. Mason was traveling at approximately 50 miles per hour when the shadows began appearing inside his headlights. A roadside sign cast one dark shape behind it. As expected, a second shadow extended sideways toward the ditch. When Mason passed a mailbox where 3 separate lines moved across the grass, he looked in the mirrors for another vehicle. The road behind him was empty. He checked for a nearby house, yard lamp, or tractor working in a field. No building stood close enough to produce the extra light. The pasture beyond the fence remained dark. Another sign approached. Its post produced several shadows at once. One pointed forward. One fell behind. A third crossed the road at an angle that matched neither the headlights nor the moon. Mason reduced his speed toward 30 miles per hour. The shadow slowed with him, sliding across weeds, fence rails, and tree trunks. Their directions remained inconsistent. Some moved as though a bright source were behind the car. Others suggested light from high above it. The headlights were not failing. Both beams remained steady and correctly aligned. Something else was lighting the road. Mason leaned toward the windshield and looked upward. A white presence held above the car. It was too close to resemble a star and too large to be a distant lamp. The brightness was smooth without flashing navigation lights or a visible beam. He could not determine its exact shape. Whenever Mason tried to focus on the outer edge, the brightness seemed to lose definition. At moments, it looked circular, then broader. Beneath it, a darker area suggested a smooth underside, hidden by the light. The object made no sound. A helicopter should have been impossible to miss at that height. Rotor noise would have filled the car, and moving air would have disturbed the trees and roadside grass. The branches remained still. The white presence seemed to travel directly above or slightly behind the roof, matching the vehicle without obvious effort. Mason placed his phone in one hand and tried to wake the screen. Nothing happened. He pressed the side button again. The display stayed black. The battery had been healthy when he left his cousin's property. The phone had been connected to the charger during part of the drive. He held the button longer. No vibration, no logo. The device appeared completely dead. The dashboard clock had also changed. Instead of showing the time, it displayed 12. No minutes, no flashing separator, only 12. Other systems remained active. The speedometer worked. The fuel gauge remained steady. The engine temperature was normal. Mason slowed further and pulled onto the gravel shoulder. The moment the tires left the pavement, the sound beneath the car seemed to weaken. Gravel should have struck the wheel wells in sharp, uneven bursts. Instead, the noise arrived as a soft, distant texture. He stopped the car. The white presence stopped with him. Mason sat with both hands on the steering wheel and listened. The engine was running. He could feel a faint vibration through the seat, but the sound itself seemed separated from the machine. The usual low hum had been pressed flat. He opened the door. Cold air entered without the normal rush of outside noise. Mason stepped onto the shoulder. His boots touched gravel, but the crunch beneath them sounded several yards away. He closed the door and looked at the ground. His body cast more than one shadow. A dark line extended from his left leg toward the ditch. Another crossed beneath the car. A third, fainter shape reached forward along the road. One body, several directions. Mason raised an arm. The shadows copied the movement, but not perfectly. One seemed to begin before another, creating the brief impression that his outline had been divided into separate moments. He looked above the car again. The white light occupied a broad area overhead. Around it, the darker underside appeared almost matte, absorbing rather than reflecting the headlights and pale moonlight. Mason could not hold the shape in focus. His eyes kept sliding toward the brightness at its edge. The object seemed close enough that he should have seen seams, panels, or some clear surface. Instead, the center remained dark and smooth, while the surrounding light erased its boundaries. There was still no wind, no engine, no movement in the nearby trees. Mason held the dead phone toward the object and pressed the button once more. The screen remained black. He returned to the car. The cabin felt insulated from the road. He could hear his breathing, but even that seemed muted. When he spoke his own name aloud, the words lacked their normal weight. He shifted into drive. The car moved forward. The white presence followed. At 30 miles per hour, it remained above the roof. Mason increased his speed. The object did not fall behind. Its position, relative to the car, appeared unchanged, while fence posts and trees continued passing beneath the conflicting light. The shadows moved across the landscape as a group. Every time the road bent, their angles adjusted together. A tree might cast darkness toward the east, west, and directly beneath itself. In the same moment, the sight became more disturbing than the object. The light above Mason was difficult to define. The shadows were not. They appeared across real ground. They crossed familiar fences. They turned ordinary signs and weeds into proof that more than one direction of light existed around the car. The sound continued fading. Tire noise became a low pressure rather than a clear vibration. The engine seemed farther away. Mason pressed the accelerator and watched the speedometer rise, but the physical sense of gaining speed was weakened. For a few seconds, the road felt disconnected from the vehicle moving across it. Mason gripped the wheel harder. The light dimmed slightly, every shadow shortened, and then the object was no longer above him. It appeared behind and to the left. Mason didn't see it across the sky. There was no streak across the windshield, and no reflection moving over the roof. One moment, the brightness surrounded the car from above. The next, it came from a position beyond the rear side window. All the shadows realigned at once. Fence posts that had cast darkness in several directions now produced new lines across the pasture. Road signs changed from forward-pointing shadows to long shapes extending across the opposite lane. The shift happened too quickly to follow. Mason turned his head just long enough to see a pale white form holding above the field. The darker, lower section remained visible beneath it, though distance made the shape even less stable. The phone screen came on. It displayed the battery symbol for a moment, then opened normally. The charge level had not changed enough to explain why the device had failed. The dashboard clock still showed 12. Road sound began returning. First the tires, then the engine, then wind moving around the side mirrors. Mason accelerated. The object did not immediately fall behind. It remained beyond the rear side of the car, keeping the same apparent size as the road carried him away. Fence posts passed between them, briefly interrupting his view, but the pale presence returned after each gap. Mason reached a straighter stretch and pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine became fully audible again. The steering wheel vibrated beneath his hands. The car felt connected to speed once more. The light was still there. It might have been moving parallel to the road. It might have been much farther away than Mason believed, creating the illusion that it remained near him. He did not know. He kept driving. The white presence eventually became harder to see among the trees and uneven land behind him. Mason never witnessed a departure. He could not say whether the object stopped following, changed position again, or simply disappeared from view as the road descended. The dashboard clock returned later without being reset. Mason did not remember the exact moment. When he looked again, the correct time was displayed and advancing normally. The phone continued working. No photographs or recordings had been created during the encounter. Mason reached home and left the car beneath an outside light. He inspected the roof, windows, and body panels. There were no marks, burns, scratches, or unusual heat. The vehicle behaved normally the following day. A helicopter could account for a bright presence above a road. Separate lamps from distant farms might create overlapping shadows. Fatigue after hours of physical work could distort distance and attention. But a helicopter should have made itself heard. Distant lights should not have moved every roadside shadow together. And neither explanation accounted easily for a phone becoming unresponsive, a clock displaying only 12, and a road noise fading, while the object remained above a moving car. Mason's strongest memory was not the white shape. It was his own legs standing on the gravel, one body beneath several incompatible directions of light. He continued using the county road, though never with the same ease. When headlights or moonlight produced an unusual shadow, Mason no longer looked first at the ground. He checked what might be above him. Chapter 17. The ladder returned before morning. At approximately 6:18 a.m., the ladder was standing beneath the upstairs window. The homeowner stopped as soon as the backyard came into view. The ladder did not look abandoned or dropped. Its feet rested evenly on the damp grass. The upper section leaned against the wall at a careful angle, ending just below the bedroom window. That was not where it belonged. It was normally stored inside the garden shed. The shed doctor was closed. Its latch was still in place. The homeowner lived alone and had not used the ladder for several weeks. There had been no repair planned, no reason to move it, and no memory of entering the backyard during the night. The gate was also closed. Nothing appeared forced. He walked around the ladder slowly, looking first for the obvious signs of an intruder. There were no footprints in the wet ground. No muddy trail led from the shed. The gate had not been damaged, and the window above the ladder remained shut and locked from the inside. Nothing had been taken from the house. The ladder seemed to have been moved for one purpose: to reach that window. Beside it, the grass looked darker. The patch was roughly circular and approximately 6 or 7 feet across. It was not burned, crushed, or dry. The ground felt as damp as the rest of the lawn, yet the color had become flat and dull. The boundary was easy to see from a distance. Up close, there was no clear reason for it. No spilled liquid, no dead insects, no ash, oil, or chemical smell. The homeowner opened the shed. Garden tools stood where they had been left. Boxes remained stacked against the wall. The space where the ladder normally rested was empty. The latch showed no damage. It could be opened from outside, but only by lifting it deliberately. Wind could not have moved it. An animal could not have carried the ladder out and placed it against the wall. A prank remained possible. Someone might have entered quietly, removed the ladder, closed the shed, and left without disturbing the gate or wet ground enough to leave an obvious trail. That explanation was strange. It was not impossible. The homeowner carried the ladder back across the grass. Its feet were clean except for a little moisture from the lawn. No soil or debris suggested that it had been dragged from another property. He placed it inside the shed, returned it to its usual position, and closed the door. This time, he checked the latch twice. The darker circle remained beside the wall. He photographed it with his phone, then left for work. Several hours later, he noticed the first problem with the time. The phone showed a clock, 25 minutes ahead of the wall clocks around him. At first, he assumed the building clocks were wrong. They might not have been updated after a power interruption, or one could have lost time gradually. He checked another, then another. Each wall clock agreed. The computer display also matched them. Only the phone was ahead. The homeowner restarted the device. When it came back on, the time had corrected itself. It now matched every other clock in the room. There was no warning, update notice, or error message. He opened the settings and confirmed that automatic time adjustment was active. The phone should have been using the network, rather than keeping time by itself. The 25-minute difference seemed unrelated to the ladder. Still, the two events had happened on the same morning. That evening, he checked the backyard again. The ladder remained inside the shed. The dark patch was still visible, though less sharply defined. He inspected the upstairs window from inside, testing the lock and looking for marks around the frame. Nothing appeared disturbed. He considered calling someone to stay at the house. The thought felt excessive. There had been no entry, no theft, and no direct threat. Explaining the event aloud would make it sound like a simple act of trespassing. Someone had moved a ladder. A phone had shown the wrong time. That was all he could prove. Before going to bed, the homeowner checked the doors and windows. He locked the back door and placed a small object against it, so he would know if it opened during the night. Sleep came slowly. He woke several times and looked at the clock. At 2:11 a.m., he was fully awake. The house was quiet. No footsteps crossed the floor below. No sound came from the yard or shed. He remained in bed, listening. Nothing happened. The next thing he remembered was the alarm. It sounded at 6:30 a.m. The phone beside the bed showed 6:31. Across the room, the wall clock showed 6:06. The same difference. 25 minutes. The homeowner sat up and compared them for several seconds, waiting for one display to change or correct itself. Neither did. The phone continued forward to 6:32. The wall clock moved to 6:07. He did not restart anything. He went downstairs. The small object placed against the back door remained where he had left it. The lock was still engaged. No door or window appeared open. From the kitchen, he could see the ladder. It had returned to the same place beneath the upstairs window. The angle looked nearly identical. The feet were set on the grass. The upper section ended below the same frame. The shed door remained closed. Its latch was still in place. The darker circular patch had also returned. It appeared stronger than it had the previous evening, spreading across roughly the same 6 or 7 feet beside the ladder. The grass remained upright and damp. Nothing had been pressed into the soil. The homeowner did not touch the ladder immediately. He checked the gate, closed. He checked the ground between the shed and a house. No clear tracks. Well, he opened the shed and found everything else undisturbed. The empty ladder space was the only sign that anything had changed. The phone remained 25 minutes ahead until it was restarted later that morning. The wall clock continued normally. There was no memory between 2:11 a.m. and the alarm at 6:30. No dream. No half-awake image of walking downstairs. No sound of the shed latch. No sensation of cold grass beneath bare feet. The missing period did not feel long or troubled. It contained nothing at all. Sleepwalking could explain part of the event. A person can open doors, move objects, and return to bed without forming a memory. Stress and poor sleep can make that more likely. The homeowner might have moved the ladder on both nights and secured the shed afterward. But the back door arrangement had not changed. The shed had been latched, and carrying a ladder through wet grass should have left some mark on clothing, floors, or skin. None appeared. A prank could explain the ladder, but not easily the repeated clock difference. Faulty devices could explain the time, yet the same 25-minute offset appeared on 2 mornings, connected to the same physical change outside. The circular patch remained the weakest detail, and, in some ways, the most persistent. It might have been caused by moisture, soil, fungus, or changing light. There was no test and no sample taken, yet it appeared beside the ladder twice. The homeowner eventually moved the ladder to another locked storage space and changed the shed latch. The upstairs window remained closed, and nothing similar happened again. The yard returned to its ordinary color. The phone kept normal time. What remained was not proof of an intruder, missing time, or anything beyond sleep and faulty clocks. It was a repeated arrangement. A ladder removed from a closed shed, a dark circle beside it, 25 minutes carried by one clock and not another, and a stretch of night that ended without leaving even the smallest memory of what had happened inside it. The final witness would remember where he drove. The place itself would not remain. Chapter 18. The road that was not there. Turn right in 300 feet. Owen Mercer looked at the navigation screen, then back through the windshield. He was approximately 15 minutes from home after a late shift at the machine shop. The road ahead was one he knew almost without thinking. He had driven it in rain, snow, darkness, and early morning fog. There was no useful shortcut nearby. The command made no sense. Owen assumed there had been road work farther ahead. Navigation systems sometimes reacted to delays that had not yet appeared on roadside signs. He was tired enough to accept that explanation without checking the full route. The turn arrived exactly where the voice had promised. A narrow paved road opened on the right. Owen slowed and entered it. The surface was older than the main road, with cracks softened by years of repair. There was no painted center line. Reflectors were absent from both edges, and no sign gave the road a name. Still, it looked real. The tires moved across pavement, rather than dirt. Grass grew close to the shoulders. A wire fence ran beside the road for a short distance before fading into darkness. The navigation voice told Owen to continue for 1 mile. He glanced at the map. The blue route line extended ahead through an empty area between fields. No nearby town, property, or connecting road appeared on the screen. Owen expected the distance to begin counting down. It remained at 1 mile. The road carried him through open land without houses, mailboxes, driveways, barns, or utility poles. His headlights reached only a short distance ahead, revealing the same narrow pavement and pale roadside grass over and over again. There were no intersections, no bends sharp enough to change direction, no landmarks he could use to judge how far he had traveled. The navigation still said 1 mile. Owen reduced his speed. The radio stopped playing. The change was so clean that he first thought he had touched the controls accidentally. He pressed a preset button. The screen changed stations, but nothing came through the speakers. No music, no voices, no static. Every frequency was empty. Owen turned the volume higher. The speakers remained silent. The engine continued normally, and the headlights held steady. The truck did not lose power. Only the radio had become useless. Ahead, a pale white light stood above one of the fields. Owen first read it as a lamp attached to equipment. It appeared 15 to 20 feet above the ground, bright enough to see clearly, but too soft to reveal anything beneath it. As the truck approached, the light did not grow larger. The distance between them seemed unchanged. Owen checked the navigation again. Continue for 1 mile. The number still had not moved. He looked back through the windshield. The light now appeared farther to the left. Owen had not seen it cross the field. He had looked down for only a moment. In that brief gap, the object had occupied a new place without leaving any visible trail between the two positions. The road remained straight. Owen continued forward. Each time he checked the screen and returned his attention to the field, the light seemed slightly altered. Sometimes it appeared nearer to the road, sometimes farther ahead. Once it seemed lower, almost touching the dark horizon. Its brightness did not change. The movement was never observed, only the result. Owen began to question whether the fields themselves were repeating. The same low fence appeared beside the road. A darker group of shrubs stood ahead, passed through the headlights, and was followed by another group with nearly the same shape. The distance on the navigation display remained fixed. 1 mile. The road should have connected with something by then. Instead, the pavement ended. Owen braked. Rough grass filled the headlights. Beyond the hood, there was no barrier, warning sign, or gravel turnaround. The paved surface simply stopped at the edge of an open field. The pale light hovered beyond it. Owen estimated that it was 60 to 70 yards away. At that distance, it still offered no clear structure. The shape looked nearly circular at first, though a faint vertical stretch made it seem taller than it was wide. The glow did not spread across the grass below. The radio remained dead. Owen looked at the navigation screen. The route line had disappeared. His vehicle icon now sat inside a blank area with no road beneath it. The normal map remained around the edges, but the truck appeared separated from every marked route. He zoomed out. Nothing changed. The closest visible road lay somewhere behind him, although the screen gave no path back to it. Owen looked toward the field again. The light was closer to the center of the windshield. He had not seen it move. He turned his attention to the screen once more, then immediately raised his eyes. The object now appeared slightly higher. Each glance away seemed to allow another change. Owen stopped looking for continuous movement. He began treating the light like something that might occupy any position he was not directly watching. That thought ended his hesitation. He selected reverse. The backup camera appeared on the dashboard, showing the road behind him for less than a second. Then the image dissolved into gray static. Owen twisted in his seat and looked through the rear window instead. The pavement continued behind the truck. It appeared narrow but intact, curving into darkness farther back. He began reversing. The navigation voice returned. Proceed to the highlighted route. The map reappeared beneath the vehicle icon. A road name filled the lower part of the screen. County Route 11. Owen stopped the truck. He had been traveling on County Route 11 before the detour. According to the display, he was now back on it. But he had not turned around. He had not reached an intersection. The truck had moved backward only a short distance from the dead end. He looked forward. The pale light was gone. The road no longer ended in grass. Pavement now curved onward beyond the headlights, following a gentle line through the fields as though the dead end had never existed. The radio came back with the middle of a song. There was no announcement of lost service, no loud burst of static. Sound simply returned to the speakers at its previous volume. Owen remained still for several seconds. The engine idled. Insects moved through the roadside grass. Somewhere farther away, a vehicle passed along another road. Ordinary distance had returned. He drove forward slowly. The navigation guided him along County Route 11 without mentioning a detour. The distance home decreased normally. Road markings, reflectors, signs, and familiar intersections began appearing again. Nothing else happened. Owen reached home and parked in his usual place. Before going inside, he opened the navigation history on his phone. The recorded journey showed one continuous route along the normal main road. There was no right turn, no side road, no blank area, no stop near a field. According to the history, Owen had never left County Route 11. The arrival time also showed no obvious delay. Whatever time had been spent on the unmarked road had either been folded into the normal journey or never recorded at all. He slept badly. In daylight, Owen returned to the place where he remembered turning. The main road was easy to identify. He found the same curve, the same line of trees, and the same field opening, visible from the driver's side. There was no road on the right. A shallow ditch ran beside the pavement. Beyond it stood tall grass and an unbroken barbed wire fence. Owen parked farther ahead and walked back. The fence continued across the exact place where the turn should have been. The posts were old but upright. Wires stretched between them without a gate or opening. There was no pavement beneath the grass, no crushed vegetation, no hidden entrance, no remains of an abandoned road. Owen searched along the roadside in both directions. He found farm tracks and private driveways, but none matched the route he had taken. Every real turn was marked, gated, or connected to visible property. The navigation system may have made an error. Fatigue may have altered his sense of place. Dark fields can make distances repeat, and a narrow driveway can look like a public road when seen briefly through headlights. Yet Owen had driven over pavement. He had followed it far enough for the radio to die, the map to lose the route, and the road to end in a field. The truck had not merely passed a wrong turn. It had traveled somewhere. The phone recorded none of it. Owen stood beside the unbroken fence and tried to place the angle of the road from memory. The direction would have carried him straight through the wire, across the ditch, and into land where no paved surface existed. No road. That was the final detail. The light had not blocked his path or forced the truck from the highway. Nothing had appeared in front of the vehicle and taken control away from him. The navigation had offered a turn. The road had appeared. Owen had chosen to follow it because, for a few seconds, the impossible direction looked ordinary enough to trust. The world returned after every encounter. Radios carried voices again. Water moved with the wind. Cameras resumed recording. Clocks continued forward. Roads, fences, houses, and fields appeared ordinary in daylight. Whatever interrupted those familiar systems left very little behind. No single account proves what caused the lights, the silence, the missing seconds, or the places that failed to remain where witnesses remembered them. Some details may have come from faulty equipment, tired minds, unusual weather, or distance misread in darkness. Others remain harder to settle. Each witness was left with one small part of the experience that resisted the easiest answer. A light that did not move with the sky. Water that did not react. A road crossed at night and erased by morning. Perhaps you are still following every detail. Perhaps the voices and quiet roads have already begun to carry you towards sleep. Either way, the ordinary world is still around you now. The faint sounds outside, the steady movement of time, the familiar room holding its shape in the dark, and for tonight, that may be enough.